The story begins with our protagonist, Gale Hamilton, a young man trying to make a list of items to help him improve his party's teamwork. Suddenly, the party's leader, Cash Bilbor, called Gale over and announced that they were terminating his contract. Gale was stunned by the sudden decision, feeling as if the whole world had turned its back on him. He tried to talk to Cash and the others to understand what was happening, but was only met with rude and dismissive responses. Gale couldn't understand the reason behind Cash's actions and wondered why he was being fired so unreasonably. The other party members, Melissa, Luke, and Norris, also sided with Cash, mocking Gale and calling him useless with his support class. They claimed that Gale's cursed tools were just weird toys and didn't appreciate his contributions. As S-rank adventurers, they believed they didn't need a low-rank support mage like Gale. Gale reminded them that his cursed tools had helped the party overcome many difficult quests and that he understood how to weaken curses. Gale pointed out that not all of his artifacts were consumable items, holding up a necklace as an example. However, the other party members still found Gale's items strange and creepy, worried that he considered them normal. Cash then introduced Mora, the new support member replacing Gale. The members welcomed Mora warmly, expressing their excitement about her. Because she possessed buffing and debuffing skills, Gale pleaded for one more chance, saying he had powerful cursed tools he had never used, hoping this would catch their attention. However, his words fell on deaf ears. They were no longer interested in him or his artifacts. Realizing they never valued him at all, Gale felt betrayed, tears welling up in his eyes. Gale asked Cash if he was sure he wasn't making a mistake by kicking him out, but Cash coldly replied that they no longer needed him. Feeling hurt and betrayed, Gale decided to leave and open a cursed tool shop. He reflected on his time with the Silver Wolves and realized that even though he had always supported them to the best of his ability in his support role, they had never truly appreciated him, and he had worked for the past month completely unpaid. As Gale watched the party members enjoying themselves, he remembered the enhancement curses he had placed on their equipment. Gale decided to dispel those curses, knowing they wouldn't allow it if they found out. After dispelling the curses, Gale felt a sharp pain, but then felt relieved and filled with power. He realized he had been letting others benefit from his enhancements, while they had actually been draining his own XP. Gale left the inn and walked around town, thinking about his options. He had no money, but still had a collection of cursed tools and no longer needed the party's equipment. Recalling the idea of opening a cursed tool shop, Gale began to see potential in the idea, imagining the freedom and satisfaction of running his own store. Meanwhile, back with the Silver Wolves, Cash declared how comfortable it was now that they didn't have to deal with Gale's problems anymore. But immediately, multiple curse marks appeared above their heads, causing them all to feel weaker. The party began to panic and accused Gale of tampering with their gear, regretting that they hadn't gotten rid of him sooner. Mora, the new support mage, overheard the conversation. And while the members argued about what to do if they saw Gale again, Norris even suggested violent ideas like cutting off his fingers. However, Mora, the only sober one, began to think more deeply. She realized that the party's strength might have been dependent on Gale's enhancement curses. Struck by this possibility, Mora wondered if the party's strength was entirely due to Gale's cursed tools. Melissa noticed Mora's expression and asked if something was wrong, then offered her a glass of water. Mora accepted it, thinking further about how a normal curse specialist couldn't possibly strengthen others. If Gale's curse tools could really do that, it would have to be an incredibly powerful ability, far beyond what a typical curse user could possess. Despite her lingering doubts, the other members paid no mind. They continued to celebrate and prepare for an S-rank quest, intending to prove their worth to the Adventurers Guild. They would have to take down a behemoth, a disaster-class monster. The group cheered and raised their glasses in a toast, confident they could easily defeat the behemoth. Meanwhile, Mora felt out of place, troubled by the realization that the others still hadn't seen the true strength of Gale, the man they had just kicked out. and the immense impact he had on their party's abilities. As for Gale, he went to see a merchant to ask for advice on opening a stall. Gale expressed his desire to get a spot in the central plaza of the capital city, Rail. However, the merchant said the rent there was a bit steep, suggesting he go to the reception desk to register with the guild first. When the merchant told Gale that the rent for a spot in the central plaza was 4 gold coins a day, he stood still for a moment, pondering the figure and checking the money he had. He discovered that he only had 3 silver coins, which meant he could only afford a stall on Market Street, where it was much cheaper. Though disappointed, Gale decided that something was better than nothing. Gale brought his cursed tools to Market Street and carefully laid them out, looking around the small area he'd just acquired for his stall. The stall was a bit shabby, but Gale believed it would suit his needs just fine. He recalled the kindness of the merchant who had given him his first stall kit, shaking his hand emotionally and thanking him. Now, it was time for Gale to start his business. He decided to sell off his remaining cursed tools along with some interior decorations. However, setting the prices baffled him, since he had never sold anything before. In the end, Gale decided to set the prices based on the cost of the materials. He laid all the items out on the stall, but they looked rather bleak. Gale sensed that something was off with the presentation. Meanwhile, the merchant returned with some documents he'd forgotten to give Gale earlier. As he glanced over Gale's stall, he shook his head and declared that this display wouldn't do at all. Without hesitation, the merchant got to work, rearranging the items and setting up the stall in a neat, logical way. When he was finished, Gale's stall looked impressive, leaving him feeling incredibly grateful. The merchant advised Gale to remember that customers get annoyed if they can't find what they're looking for. And if the shop doesn't sell anything, it'll be hard to stay in business. With that piece of advice, the merchant left, leaving Gale happy and feeling lucky to have met such a kind person, after being looked down on by his old party. Now, with his stall properly arranged, Gale decided it was time to get serious. He took out his beloved necklace, knowing that sometimes sacrifices must be made, and set them on his stall for sale. He wondered what customers would think of these cursed items and whether or not they would accept them. However, Gale pushed those negative thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. He braced himself and called out like a professional salesman, announcing that he had items for adventurers that could inflict debuffs at rock-bottom prices. Immediately, adventurers started gathering around his stall, curiously looking at the rare talismans he had on display. Gale welcomed them with a bright smile, explaining that the cursed tools had their own advantages, like consuming no mana and being usable by almost anyone. Hearing this benefit, more and more people flocked over to take a look. One customer saw a deadly potion being sold for only 5 copper coins and asked about it in astonishment. Gale enthusiastically explained that the price was low because the crafting cost was practically nothing. He assured him that he had many other unique items, like charms that inflict status ailments, cursed tools that cause debuffs, and much more. Although he wasn't sure how effective they would be, the customer decided to buy one since the price was too good to pass up. Gale was pleased with another successful transaction and encouraged the customer to come back again. Another customer spotted a cool-looking sword and asked Gale about it. Gale revealed that it was an enchanted short sword, which shocked the customer when he learned it was cursed, and he argued that no one would ever buy a cursed item. Gale cleverly replied that these items were perfect for interior decorating, since they had such a cool and unique look. The customer, convinced by Gale's explanation, decided to buy the sword to ward off evil spirits from his house. Gale expressed his gratitude and threw in a few curse-breaking talismans. It was clear this guy was born to be an S-rank salesman. Gale had a unique sales style where he always made it clear to customers that the tools were cursed, and he included free curse-breaking talismans with every purchase. Most of his customers were fans of Death Metallica, who were drawn to the bizarre and grotesque designs of these items. He was in the middle of selling his enchanted boots when another customer approached to ask about a legendary tool, a testament to the power of cursed equipment. Gale understood that the mere mention of a curse was enough to make most people wary. So he always gave away curse-breaking talismans and clearly explained the curse's effects and how to remove them. Before long, his shop was packed with a line of customers eager to buy his cursed tools, mostly because they were interested in the free curse-breaking talismans. They were willing to pay just to get their hands on tools with such unique designs. Gale continued selling at a steady pace, and before he knew it, he had sold out of everything. He was quite surprised to see everything sell out in such a short time. Immediately after, more people rushed towards him, asking if his was the shop giving away free curse-breaking talismans and if he had any left. Gale announced that he was sold out, leaving the customers quite disappointed. Gale realized that the curse-breaking talismans had become unexpectedly popular. As the customers looked at him with longing eyes, he promised he would be back with his stall in the exact same spot tomorrow, and then quickly made an excuse to leave. Meanwhile, some of the people who bought the cursed tools from Gale began to test them out. They had bought these items as a way to prove they were brave enough to overcome their fear of cursed objects. One person tried on a ring and noticed his stats increased significantly, with a system window popping up to inform him he had gained a 50% increase in strength. The others also tested their cursed items and were all astonished by their powerful effects, so much so that they no longer hesitated to keep the curses, even though they had the option to remove them if needed. One adventurer remarked that getting a curse removed at the temple was very expensive, and they considered buying more curse-breaking talismans from Gale to resell for a profit. Another adventurer advised everyone to keep those ideas to themselves, since the temple wouldn't be pleased if it found out. They pointed out that the temple charges an exorbitant amount of gold to break curses, and emphasized the talent of the curse breaker they had met. They gossiped that any guild would be fighting to have Gale on their team. Little did they know, this talented curse breaker was once humiliated and abandoned by his own party. Now, Gale creates cursed tools with S-rank effects, yet he sells them for incredibly cheap prices. Rumors began to spread throughout the imperial capital about a mysterious curse breaker who would appear in a flash, sell his cursed items, and then disappear just as quickly. Gale, as he was known, was completely unaware of these rumors or the S-rank power of the tools he created, content only with his now heavy coin purse. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the members of the Wolfpack party, Cash and the others, were engaged in their S-rank quest. They were struggling against a monster that could easily block their attacks without letting them even get close. Cash was confused, not understanding why this was happening to them because it made absolutely no sense. He felt frustrated, and for good reason. As they were S-rank adventurers, Cash wondered why they were being beaten by a goblin that had been no trouble at all and was easily defeated just a few days ago. But just a few hours earlier, when they had accepted the S-rank quest, Melissa had asked Cash if it was wise to take on such a high-level quest right away with a new member. Cash was confident that everything would be fine, as he had personally chosen Mora, who had a good reputation in the guild. This answer somewhat reassured the group, and they told Mora they were counting on her. Mora seemed a bit flustered but responded with a strained smile. Cash noticed something was off around them and warned the members to get ready because there was a goblin up ahead. However, despite the whole group working together, they couldn't take down a single simple goblin. Luke's arrows all went off course, causing him to struggle to control them. Melissa yelled at Luke for his clumsiness during the intense fight. She decided to face the goblin alone, but in the next moment, the goblin launched an attack, sending Melissa flying into a tree trunk. Cash couldn't react to the situation, so he turned and ordered Norris to seize the opportunity. However, Norris took longer than usual to cast his spell, and after he finished, only a small, weak spark appeared. Cash screamed at Norris for failing to unleash a powerful spell, yelling that the weak flame wouldn't even tickle the goblin. Too focused on Norris, Cash forgot about the goblin, and in that moment, it charged at him again. Fortunately, Mora managed to pull Cash out of harm's way in time, using her support magic to save him. Worried, she asked if Cash was all right. But instead of being grateful, Cash yelled at her for her bad timing, saying she should have been focused on buffing the entire party. Mora explained that she had been using all her strength to empower them throughout the fight, even putting her staff on the ground and using the last of her remaining power to cast an additional support spell on Cash. She announced that all of Cash's stats had been doubled and urged him to quickly finish the goblin, as this should be an easy challenge for S-rankers. Cash was thrilled to hear his stats were doubled, determined to kill the goblin to satisfy his rage. Energized, he charged forward to crush his opponent. As he got closer to the goblin, the monster struck, but Cash dodged it. Thinking he had the upper hand, he swung his sword at the goblin. But, to his surprise, the goblin effortlessly blocked Cash's sword as if it were nothing. It started picking its nose, then lifted Cash up while he was still stunned from the blocked attack. Right after, with a powerful throw, the goblin hurled Cash towards Mora. Mora quickly put up a protective barrier, blocking the goblin's next attack. However, Cash called Mora a complete failure of a support mage, even though she specialized in enhancement magic. Cash kept calling her useless because those spells didn't seem to be helping him at all. Feeling blamed, Mora reminded him that he was the one who told her to save her enhancement spells for the fight with the behemoth. Mora declared she had no other choice but to use the cursed tool that Gale had left for her. She thought it could significantly weaken the goblin. In response, Cash immediately grabbed her by the collar, warning her not to use Gale's cursed items, because he believed they wouldn't do any good. Mora was furious, remembering Gale's kindness and leaving notes to help her adjust to her new role in the party, documenting the Wolfpack's habits, and even his supportive letter for her. Gale had also left some cursed tools for her to use whenever she wanted, because he knew full well that these cowards wouldn't dare face the monster until she weakened it for them, just like he used to. Cash let go of Mora's collar and pinned all the blame on Gale. He told everyone that it was all Gale's fault and that the magic circle from yesterday wasn't a dispel spell, but a curse. Melissa, Norris, and Luke agreed, all thinking that Gale was just a loser who caused them trouble. In the middle of the battle, they started arguing, mocking Gale as being completely useless. Cash admitted that the path ahead would surely be dangerous, but he didn't want to retreat, being too proud as an S-rank adventurer. Melissa understood how he felt, while Norris reminded them they couldn't even fight if they wanted to because of Gale's curse. They suggested they should fully recover their strength before trying to fight again, calling it a strategic retreat and seeing it as the perfect chance to escape while the goblin wasn't paying attention to them. Cash agreed to give up for now and decided to retreat, continuing to blame the curse. Mora was stunned by their change in fighting spirit and tried to convince them to persevere, wondering if they really were an S-rank adventurer party. Cash spoke up, saying the rest of the team was badly injured from the fight, while Mora didn't have a single scratch on her. She didn't understand what he meant until Cash explained that, as the new member, she should also join the fight. They assigned Mora to guard the rear. Mora couldn't believe they were going to leave a support mage like her, who couldn't use any attack skills, to face the goblin. Now, Mora was standing next to the goblin, and it suddenly asked her if she was having a hard time too. It'd be great if this goblin was the main character. In a panic, Mora hastily used the cursed scroll she had. The next moment, the scroll began to glow, and she seized the opportunity to run away. Meanwhile, the other members were resting by a tree, exhausted from the long escape. Melissa blamed the new girl, Mora, saying she was useless to them. However, Luke pointed out that they were the ones who had gotten weaker, but Melissa still blamed Mora, accusing her of showing off her chest and distracting the party. Everyone ignored what she said and went back to blaming Gale. Just then, Mora arrived, and Cash commended her for successfully getting away from the goblin. But then he noticed something small clinging to Mora's back. Thanks to Gale's curse, the goblin had shrunk down and turned into a child. Meanwhile, in the city, Gale was finding it enjoyable to run his stall. and wished that more people, not just adventurers, would buy his items. Lately, he'd run into a weird adventurer who would just stare at him with bloodshot eyes and burst out laughing. With the money he'd earned, Gale decided to move his stall to the noble district to attract wealthier customers, and silently hoped he would never see that strange adventurer again. At the same time, a young lady from a nearby street corner was watching his stall with great interest. Mora Glaris had finally escaped the goblin and was heading back to where her former teammates had abandoned her. She returned looking exhausted and haggard. Her old companions showed no remorse for their actions. Melissa, ever the jealous one, was angry that Mora was late, taunting that her large chest must have slowed her down. The other members were indifferent, merely suggesting they leave the forest as soon as possible. Just then, Cash noticed something crawling on Mora's cloak. It was a mini version of the goblin. Then, poof! The effect of the cursed tool Gale had left behind kicked in, and the goblin returned to its original size. Cash and the other members started screaming and blaming Mora, but she quickly made her exit, leaving her old friends to face the giant monster. In a panic, the group scrambled to hide behind one another to get away from the goblin. Luke even suggested the goblin eat Melissa, saying that women are tastier and softer. As they bolted, the goblin just stood there, silently thinking to itself that it was, in fact, a vegetarian. 4 days later, the entire Wolfpack party showed up at an inn looking miserable and utterly exhausted, slumping over a table and weakly asking for water while some just wanted a bath. The other patrons in the inn stared judgmentally at the smelly group, whose stench filled the room, forcing people to cover their noses. Mora was sitting at the counter, and the innkeeper curiously asked about her party, who were now at a table behind them. Still furious, Mora bluntly replied that they had brought this upon themselves. Cash called out loudly to the innkeeper, demanding water, towels, or anything they could get, while Luke complained about the terrible service. The innkeeper responded by placing a single glass of water on the table and told the 4 smelly adventurers flat out that she wasn't running a charity. What a savage comeback. Cash was clearly infuriated by the comment, yelling that the innkeeper had no idea who they were. In fact, she knew very well, and in her eyes, they were just a bunch of freeloaders who couldn't pay their bills. She informed them that their advance payment only covered up to yesterday, and if they didn't pay more, she expected them to leave right after finishing their water. Cash fumbled for his coin purse, muttering something about being an S-rank adventurer. After some rummaging, he realized that the wolf pack was completely broke. Melissa seized the opportunity to quickly down the single glass of water the innkeeper had brought, leaving the 3 men to howl in outrage. They turned to look at Mora, who was waiting for her food at the counter, clearly intending to mooch off her. Melissa roughly grabbed Mora, while Cash started patting her down, searching for her coin purse. All the while, they continued to blame Gale for all their misfortune, even accusing him of being the reason they went broke. The 4 team members seemed pleased with the money they'd just swiped. But Mora wasn't one to be trifled with. She swiftly landed a punch right in Cash's face, then took care of Melissa and the other 2 worms, Luke and Norris. Mora made short work of them and cleaned up the mess for the innkeeper. This was her sweet way of saying goodbye to the wolf pack. She apologized for the broken table and mugs, but the innkeeper was just glad to be rid of the fools. Back in town, Gale was savoring every moment as he set up his stall in the noble district. He attracted countless wealthy customers, curious about his masterpieces. His day began with a noblewoman, flanked by her bodyguards. She bought Gale's lizard lamp, which was actually a basilisk, finding it strangely fascinating. As the day went on, Gale managed to sell quite a lot. However, his handmade combat gear and items didn't attract much attention, which left him a little disheartened that no one truly appreciated his designs. Just as Gale was about to pack up, a beautiful, plainly dressed young lady suddenly rushed over, making him stay open a little longer. Gale wondered if she was a noble, since it was clear that a bodyguard was secretly watching her from a distance. Gale watched the girl, who seemed to light up with delight, as if she were in her own personal, cute stationery shop. She bought a small, pretty ring and showered him with praise, moving Gale to the verge of tears. Gale offered to give her a discount since she was the first person to praise his designs, but she instead handed him a large gold coin and skipped away, leaving Gale lost in a state of bliss. In his excitement, Gale forgot to give her the curse-breaking charm for the ring she bought. It wasn't a huge problem, really. The ring would just increase defense and resistance to instant death blows by 200%. But once put on, it couldn't be taken off. Besides, she was rich, so she could probably just go to a temple to have the curse removed. However, right after she left, the girl was kidnapped in an alley by a female knight and taken to the palace. It turned out she was none other than Princess Carla of the kingdom. Immediately, royal guards flooded the town, searching for a young man with black hair and a blue coat who was selling things in the market. The reason? He dared to speak to the princess and even sold her strange items. Gale was almost spotted by the guards, but he quickly used a magic charm to change his face into that of an old man. The guard walked past, apologized, and continued his search. Quickly, Gale used a dispel charm to remove the transformation and decided to leave town immediately for his own safety. However, he was suddenly surrounded by curious children, demanding he perform magic since they'd seen him transform. While Gale was trying to convince them to be quiet, at the Grand Palace, the beautiful Princess Carla was lounging comfortably on her soft bed. Beside her, the special ring she'd just bought from a young man. The knight, Vivian, tried to remind Carla that buying cursed items was an insult to the faith, but Carla paid her no mind. To her, connecting with her people was a necessary duty for a princess. Vivian shot her a stern look, her eyes landing on the cursed items scattered throughout Carla's room. Carla felt that no one understood the appeal of these strange items quite like she did. Vivian simply reminded her that she had a meeting with a delegation from a neighboring country this morning and should be preparing. But Carla wasn't listening, completely absorbed in slipping the strange ring onto her finger, eager to see how it looked on her. At the Adventurers Guild, Gale was enjoying a hearty meal after a hard day's work. At first, he'd been worried about living on his own, but so far, he was actually enjoying it. Turns out, he had a knack for going solo and found satisfaction in running his own business and dining alone. He thought about stocking up on more materials soon and figured it might be time to prepare to move on to another city. As Gale was taking his tray to be cleared, he ran into some unexpected visitors at the Adventurers Guild, his old party members, begging to borrow 10 to 20 gold coins because they were S rank. But the girl in charge of the guild gently turned them down, explaining that they hadn't completed a single quest since their promotion, which was highly unusual for an S rank party. The party tried to make up some pathetic excuses, but there was no hiding the truth. They had just failed to defeat an A-rank ogre and had caused a ton of trouble around town in the process. Not only had Mora left their party, but complaints had been filed against them, putting them deep in debt. Ultimately, the receptionist stood firm and refused the loan, and it looked like the failed party wouldn't be asking again. Gale found the whole scene both pathetic and amusing. Just then, the party decided to shift the blame to Gale, claiming that he had cursed them and that Mora had been a completely useless replacement. Blaming others seemed to have become their favorite hobby. The receptionist immediately set the foolish group straight. Mora is one of the best support mages in the entire capital. She said it was embarrassing that she had once recommended the Wolf Pack as one of the finest parties. Standing nearby, Gale listened with glee, savoring the drama. He felt a deep satisfaction hearing his old party get the dressing down they thoroughly deserved. The receptionist continued, and then unexpectedly directed a compliment toward Gale. She declared that he was a fantastic creator of curse-dispelling charms and had made some of the highest quality ones for the guild. Gale blushed at the praise, while the Wolf Pack stormed out of the guild in a huff. Delusionally, they declared they would return to pay off that ridiculous debt and would start taking easy quests to break the curse they believed Gale had put on them. Watching them storm off, Gale found the situation genuinely unsettling. How could they even think he had cursed them? Now that he had completely dispelled all of his own curses, he had absolutely no ties left to the people who had abandoned him. Still, he decided to leave the guild at once, just in case he ran into them and they decided to take their anger out on him. Outside the guild, Gale overheard two royal guards hurriedly discussing how the princess and Vivian were in trouble again. Apparently, the princess was hiding under her blanket in terror, while Vivian was in a panic over a cursed ring that wouldn't come off and was emitting a dark aura. No matter how hard she tried, the princess couldn't get it off, and she had a foreign delegation to receive any minute. At that point, Vivian suggested cutting off the princess's finger, which made Carla scream in terror. In the end, the princess had to wrap her finger in a cute ribbon and went to the audience. When the delegation arrived, they brought a large gift box with them, filled with the finest teas and sweets from their country. The princess was visibly excited, but something terrible happened when the box was opened. Beneath the layer of sweets, a group of armored bandits burst out and suddenly fired arrows at the princess, attempting to assassinate her. However, a miracle occurred. The princess was protected by a barrier that emanated from Gale's ring, causing all the arrows and daggers to fall to the ground. All the bandits were captured, and Princess Carla, still terrified, was brought to safety at the Star Palace, a massive temple. Here, Carla and Vivian met Father Uriel, the appraiser Arizel, who was examining her ring. He was astonished by its power and had no trouble dispelling the curse, but he was also impressed by the ring's incredible quality. The priest even suggested that its creator must be a master of the cursing arts. To think that such a master was handing out rings like candy all over town. The priest and the appraiser couldn't help but marvel at this magnificent cursed item. As they thoroughly analyzed its every capability, the ring had made the princess immune to all assassination attempts and was compared to the greatest treasures of the empire, such as the heart of the demon king. But even that treasure drained the user's energy. While this ring demanded nothing yet possessed world-class quality, the princess wanted Vivian to bring the young man to her so she could thank him properly. Vivian had initially intended to chop Gale into pieces, but that was no longer the case after he saved the princess's life. Early in the morning, the sound of birdsong filled the air, and Gale donned an impressive new outfit made at a luxurious city shop. He had a large cloak with inner pockets for his many cursed tools, iron gauntlets, armor with strong iron thread, and embroidered boots for carrying his luggage. Gale had brought all his cursed tools and his homemade dagger. It was time for him to leave the city. Perhaps for the last time, he would gaze upon the royal capital. Gale felt every breath of the morning air, watching the city awaken and its residents begin their day, all of which felt special to him. Suddenly, an alley caught Gale's attention. A group of 4 people were shivering on the ground like beggars. For a moment, Gale thought they might be his old comrades, but he quickly dismissed the thought and continued walking toward the city center. As he walked into town, Gale came face to face with the city knights who were rushing through the town. They were clearly looking for a dirty-looking young man with black hair who was selling unaesthetic accessories. That couldn't possibly be Gale, since his accessories weren't unaesthetic at all, and he didn't look shabby. Note, Gale is completely lacking in self-awareness. He even bumped into one of the knights and was immediately let go because he looked quite neat. Gale panicked and decided to leave the city immediately, cursing himself for being naive enough to reminisce about this stupid city, even for a moment. At this time of day, there were dozens of passenger carriages. He just had to pick a city to go to. He wanted to go somewhere crowded with plenty of opportunities. But then something else caught his attention. Gale heard a man calling out ticket prices for the farming town of Farm Edge. Just the thought of food and delicious farm produce was enough to make Gale's mouth water, so he immediately decided to go to Farm Edge. And he wasn't the only one. There was also a girl buying a ticket, none other than the support mage, Mora Glaris. Gale definitely recognized that beautiful face, but there was one problem. Gale had a bad habit of blurting out his thoughts. Mora grabbed him by the collar as Gale begged for forgiveness. pleading that he was just a nobody who should be ignored. But Mora wasn't having it and gave him a punch he wouldn't forget, reminding him that he was no different from the others in the wolf pack. Afterward, the two sat side by side on the cart, and Mora wished Gale a pleasant trip, her voice dripping with rage. Gale felt sleepy, but Mora kept pushing him away because he was sitting too close to her, even though Gale had nowhere else to sit. Because the cart was filled with iron, steel, and imported goods, leaving only a few spots for passengers. Unable to contain his curiosity, Gale asked Mora how she felt about the wolf pack situation. She replied nonchalantly, without a hint of emotion, while Gale was still feeling betrayed. Mora bluntly said she didn't understand why he had stayed with that terrible group for so long. She mentioned how Cash couldn't even defeat a single goblin, which left Gale stunned, because he had never realized how much of an impact he had on the group. Mora couldn't believe how Cash could be the leader with such poor combat skills, and the other three were no better, unable to properly wield a sword, cast a spell, or shoot a bow. She had just been unlucky to join such an incompetent group. Gale fell into thought for a moment. He used to think Cash was a hero, but now he realized Cash was just a pathetic loser. Mora added that whenever something went wrong, the wolf pack would blame Gale and criticize him. She mentioned how she would stand on the sidelines and listen to their words, but then quickly fell silent, thinking that perhaps Gale didn't want to talk about it. However, Gale simply apologized softly to Mora for the trouble his old group had caused her. The cart continued to roll along the bumpy road, and Gale glanced over at Mora, noticing she didn't have much food or supplies. He decided to open his backpack and surprisingly brought out a miniature kitchen with bread, cabbage, and delicious meat to prepare an appetizing sandwich. Gale offered some to Mora, who accepted immediately, as the food looked too tempting. He also didn't forget to share some with the family of 3 sitting in front of them. Then Gale took out a bottle of fine wine, and everyone enjoyed the meal with great cheer. While they ate, he told Mora about his stall and the chaotic market before he left, where everyone was buzzing with rumors that a sacred relic had appeared at some stall. Gale wondered how someone could sell such an amazing item without realizing it was him. Once again, his lack of self-awareness showed. The stall and the sacred relic actually belonged to him, but he decided to keep the secret from Mora. After a few cups of wine and some cheerful laughter, the cargo cart suddenly overturned. Everyone inside the cart was thrown down, in awkward positions, and it took them a long moment to grasp the situation. An orc attack had suddenly descended upon the caravan. The mercenaries and passengers all thought this was the end, and a child began to sob uncontrollably. None of the passengers had any combat experience except for Gale and Mora, but both of them were only range support, having never fought directly. However, they had no choice but to join the fight. Mora held her staff and a small knife, while Gale had a few consumable items and a dagger. They weren't ideal weapons, but they would have to do in this urgent situation. Gale tried to stop Mora from stepping forward, since they weren't front-line fighters. Deciding to fight now was a reckless move, but he decided to trust Mora. He moved forward and asked her to cover his back. Since the orcs wouldn't expect a counterattack, Gale figured taking the lead was their best bet. He quickly put up a shield, and Mora immediately prepared to buff him. She took out her staff, and the moment Gale drew his dagger, a wave of dark energy flooded the space around them. Gale simply pointed his dagger at the orcs, and that sinister energy began to swirl around him. For the first time, Gale's hidden potential was about to be unleashed. Mora felt an intense, cursed energy radiating from the dagger Gale was pointing at the orcs. He looked confident and didn't seem to need any support. Mora remembered their earlier conversation, when she said the buff would take time to activate, and that she planned to find the right moment to cast it on Gale. Once the buff took effect, Gale would be strong enough to take down 1 or even 2 ogres, according to their plan. Gale would use the curse tool to slow down the orcs and take out as many as possible before they could recover. He had agreed to the plan, admitting that if they could buy enough time, it would be extremely effective. Mora reminded him that they only had one shot at this. However, seeing the dark aura radiating from the dagger, Mora couldn't help but wonder what it really was. Gale explained that it was just an ordinary dagger used for debuffing, leaving Mora stunned as to how he could possibly call something like that ordinary. The ever-carefree Gale simply asked her to keep covering his back. Determined, Mora began to chant the buffing spell. She knew this spell's effect was short-lived, so she decided to use Omniboost, causing Gale to feel a powerful surge of strength. Meanwhile, Gale had skillfully thrown a scroll right into the middle of the orcs. His aim was perfect, and the scroll landed exactly where he intended. As the scroll unfurled, a dark aura appeared, enveloping the orcs, which immediately made them feel an incredible weight and horrifying pressure. Sweat poured down their bodies, and the air around them felt like a living hell. Even Mora could feel the deathly presence of this dark aura. The orcs couldn't withstand the immense pressure, collapsing to their knees in terror. Mora was astonished by the incredible power of the curse tool Gale had just used. She realized Gale's ability to debuff was far beyond what she'd ever imagined. Even though the curse only affected monsters, she still felt the tension. Afraid she might get cursed herself if she wasn't careful in battle. Regardless, Gale decided it was time to finish off the orcs. Mora tried to warn him that the buff hadn't fully taken effect yet, but he charged forward anyway, dagger in hand. In the blink of an eye, Gale closed in on his target. His sharp gaze locked onto an orc's neck. Mora was worried since Gale wasn't buffed, but she was left completely speechless when she saw him take down the orc all by himself, its head flying high into the air, and Gale didn't need any buffs at all. He quickly lunged at the next terrified orc and effortlessly sliced it in two with his curse-laden dagger. Gale let out a laugh, amazed by his newfound power, and thanked Mora, thinking it was all thanks to her buff. Mora was just bewildered, because she hadn't actually buffed him at all. She was beginning to realize that Gale's curse tool did far more than simply weaken his opponents, and it instilled fear, lowered defenses, and could even paralyze his enemies. The tool's power was far beyond anything she had ever encountered. The dagger Gale held in his hand, not only does it have two auto-buff abilities, allowing him to bypass defenses and avoid detection traps, but it's also a legendary magic weapon. However, Gale's carefree, indifferent attitude towards this extraordinary power was driving Mora mad. Perhaps to keep our own sanity, we should just assume that Gale cursed himself by trading 90% of his IQ for top-tier cursing skills. Suddenly, Gale began to glow. As Mora's buffs finally took effect, sending his stats skyrocketing. He was thrilled to be buffed by a top-tier support mage. Mora tried to correct him, saying he was doing it all himself, but Gale was confident that with their combined power, they could defeat any opponent. Mora grew increasingly worried by Gale's behavior, but he just continued to relish the power, crushing the orcs like he was swatting flies. As he took down another orc, they noticed larger, more powerful orcs suddenly appearing. Gale was stunned by their abrupt arrival. To deal with the new threat, he threw vials containing curses toward the orcs. As the vials shattered, the curse's effect spread, immobilizing the orcs. Without hesitation, Gale continued to slice through the orcs, whose movements were now sluggish, marveling at how slow his opponents had become. Mora knew that these effects weren't from her buffs, but Gale was still convinced it was her doing. His naivety was both impressive and irritating, because slowing an enemy by 90% was clearly more than just slowing them down. The surprises didn't end there. Mora was utterly shocked to see Gale approach an orc from behind, and a terrifying killing intent emanated from his dagger. With a single light touch, the orc's neck was severed, and it collapsed lifelessly to the ground. Mora realized this was the effect of an ultra-rare skill called instant kill, which was normally only found on large weapons. Gale wiped the blood from his face, while Mora still couldn't shake the chilling sensation from his aura. He looked at her, causing Mora to immediately take a defensive stance. Clearly, Gale was a formidable warrior. But then he suddenly broke into a brilliant smile, and Mora was left baffled. It turned out this guy was just a harmless ball of sunshine. Mora still didn't know how to react to Gale's complete lack of awareness. As he excitedly danced around and grabbed her hands, passionately praising her support magic, Mora could only roll her eyes and accept the praise. The passengers from the carriage approached them, breathing a sigh of relief to see Gale and Mora safe amidst the scattered orc corpses. They expressed their deepest gratitude. As night fell, everyone gathered around the campfire, and Gale confided in Mora that this was his first time ever facing monsters. He admitted he was terrified at first, but Mora couldn't comprehend his fear since he looked like he was having the time of his life during the fight. Gale explained that despite being with Cash's party from the beginning, he never had a chance to fight directly because he was just a curse maker. Mora realized that Gale either didn't appreciate his own talents, or perhaps he was just completely unaware of his true abilities. She tried to reassure him, emphasizing his skills, and even complimented the excellent coffee he had made. However, Gale just laughed and brushed it off. Despite being good at so many things, he always chose to focus on his own negative points. Welcome to another episode of the Protagonist Self-Awareness Challenge. Mission Impossible. To be fair, after being used and looked down upon for so long, Gale had truly come to believe he was good for nothing. It was actually quite sad. Anyway, it was time for bed, and Mora thanked Gale for the coffee, reminding him to get some rest for the next day. Gale wished Mora a good night and remained by the fire, looking at the grateful faces of the people he had just saved. He felt happy that he was able to help people, and gazed up at the starry night sky. Satisfied with the words of encouragement he had received, Gale had never thought of himself that way before, and still believed it was all thanks to Mora's magic. He remembered the days of just standing on the sidelines, with no chance to fight monsters, and now the joy of defeating them made him smile to himself, experiencing new feelings he'd never had before. He truly believed that Mora was a kind and trustworthy person, while Mora just felt pity for his lack of self-awareness. Another day passed, and the driver announced to everyone that they were nearing their destination. Not long after, they arrived at the gates of the town of Farm Edge. Gale and Mora stepped off the carriage with a sense of relief. Finally setting foot in the town, it marked the beginning of their new adventures among the sprawling farms, the quaint little houses, and the fields full of livestock. Since the carriage couldn't go the whole way due to the rough roads, the two had to continue on foot, taking in the beautiful agricultural scenery stretching out around them. Mora asked Gale about his plans. Gale shared that he was planning to stop by the guild to trade in the materials from the orcs they'd collected for some much-needed cash. He also mentioned he'd see if there were any suitable quests while he was there. As they talked, Mora suggested seeing if any parties were recruiting, but Gale expressed his desire to enjoy his freedom for a while, confident he could find an ideal hunting spot on his own. With their decision made, the two headed to the Adventurers Guild. Inside the guild, Gale chose a quest, making Mora worry if he could handle the dangerous challenges on his own. Gale gave her a reassuring smile, promising her he'd be fine. Mora tried to convince Gale to reconsider, but he responded by inviting her to join him on the undead extermination quest. Unsure about joining such a dangerous quest, Mora reminded him that they were both support types, and worried if they could handle it as smoothly as they did the orcs. Gale, frustrated by her hesitation, told Mora to just watch, insisting that quests like this were his specialty. Determined to prove himself, Gale accepted the quest. Just as the two were finalizing their plans, the guildmaster, Gimli, approached them. Gale and Mora turned their attention to her. Noticing Gale's new face, Gimli asked if he was new to the area. Gale admitted he'd just come from the royal capital and was thinking of relocating to the riverside area. Gimli was delighted to hear this, explaining that the town was in need of adventurers since it mainly focused on agriculture and trade. She grabbed Gale's hands, expressing her gratitude for his arrival. As the shortage of adventurers had been causing her a lot of trouble, Mora glared at the two of them. disgusted by Gimli's attempt to play the pity card. Gimli asked if Mora would be joining Gale on the quest, and Mora replied that she was just a companion from the royal capital. Thrilled to have two adventurers, Gimli excitedly asked about Gale's profession, guessing he might be a thief. Gale corrected her, revealing he was a support-type curse artisan. Hearing this, Gimli became a bit hesitant, trying to downplay the importance of his class. Gale explained that although he was mainly support, he could still fight when necessary. Gimli apologized if she seemed judgmental, saying that curse artisans were rare these days and wondered what kind of work would suit him. Confident in his abilities, Gale stated he would complete a few local quests to get acclimated before deciding on his next move. Gimli noticed that Gale had chosen the undead extermination quest in the underground cemetery, and just hearing the name of the place was enough to hint at the challenges that awaited. This area was abandoned because it's dangerous, and sometimes the undead even appear, causing trouble for the villagers. Gimli was skeptical of Gale's ability to handle such a perilous mission in his role as a curse artisan. Mora was furious, demanding that Gimli take back what she'd said about Gale. Meanwhile, Gale, looking confident, reassured Gimli that he was more than capable of handling the mission. Gimli warned that if Gale got lost in there, no one would be able to come and rescue him. Unfazed, Gale expressed his excitement to explore the place the next day and asked if Gimli had a map of the area. Gimli happily provided one and offered to sell him holy or magical items. However, Gale declined, as he didn't need anything else for this particular mission. Before they left, Gimli reminded him to be careful, as many adventurers had failed to complete the mission. Mora, feeling jealous of Gimli's friendliness towards Gale, stomped on his shoe, making him yelp in pain. Gimli noticed Mora's jealousy and remarked that the two seemed very close. Before formally welcoming them to the farming city of Farm Edge, she introduced herself as the guild master, and they exchanged formal bows. Gale suddenly remembered he had one more piece of business to take care of, so he asked Gimli to exchange some orc materials for cash, which surprised her a little since blood was still dripping from the bag. Once that was done, Gale promised to do his best, and the two of them left the guild. Mora, thinking back on their conversation, felt Gale was rather naive, a trait she believed wouldn't do him any favors in building a solid foundation for his life. Hearing her comment, Gale simply admitted he was a bit dense, and Mora turned away, flustered, trying to hide her feelings. Noticing her reaction, Gale asked if there was something else she wanted to say. She sighed and confessed that she hadn't originally planned to come with him, but had ultimately decided to stay. She confessed this hesitantly, looking a bit anxious, but didn't back out of accompanying him. Stopping in the middle of the road, she met Gale's gaze as he calmly listened to her explanation. Mora said that she wasn't exactly worried about him, but she felt he relied too much on others, like a character who always needs to be saved. Gale looked her straight in the eye, smiled, and felt that Mora's presence was actually very reassuring. Faced with his directness, Mora became flustered, trying to hide how flustered she was. He continued to express his joy at having her by his side, which made her blush even more, leaving her wondering why she was feeling so strange. Meanwhile, Gimli sat on a balcony under the night sky, looking out at the cliffs, and told herself that she knew Gale was no ordinary curse artisan. The next morning, Mora and Gale started their day with a hearty breakfast. They could feel the curious stares of the villagers, since adventurers were a rare sight in this region. After finishing their meal, the two set off for the cemetery where the mission was to take place. Gale was eager to get started and finish the mission quickly, while Mora seemed more apprehensive. She carried a bag full of essential items for dealing with the undead, and said it was just a standard precaution. Gale, unconcerned, reassured her that everything would be fine, as he was very skilled at dealing with undead-type enemies. As they entered the cemetery, Mora warned that they should retreat immediately if anything went wrong. Gale agreed. The place was surrounded by rows of tombstones and ancient graves. Gale found the scenery captivating, while Mora couldn't understand what was so great about the scattered skeletons and decaying corpses. Gale immediately began to inspect the area. After spotting some footprints left by the undead, she wondered if this place had been a dungeon centuries ago, given how ancient it looked. Worried about the potential consequences of disturbing the spirit's final resting place, she stressed the importance of respecting the dead. Gale, however, argued that they needed to investigate further and examine the skeletons. While inspecting, Gale found an undead skull lying dormant in the sunlight and informed Mora that it would come to life when night fell. She trembled at the thought, so Gale decided to reassure her by picking the skull up. As she watched nervously, he suddenly moved the skull's jaw, startling Mora, who reacted instantly with a punch so powerful it shattered the skull. "Hey, what happened to respecting the dignity of the undead?" Gale blurted out pointedly. Mora explained that undead creatures were an exception since they were just monsters. Overwhelmed by the creepy atmosphere, Mora said she wanted to leave the place as soon as possible. Gale, noticing her fear, suggested she wait outside while he continued to explore. He realized this graveyard had just recently been turned into a dungeon, which meant they would only encounter low-level creatures on the shallow floors. Mora found Gale's words of encouragement did little to help, and despite trying to wait outside with a lantern, her fear pushed her to follow him inside. When faced with numerous undead creatures, panic caused Mora to cling tightly to Gale for protection, which flustered him. As they confronted a few zombies, she even used Gale himself as a weapon against them. In a moment of desperation, Mora threw her lantern at the skeletons, causing them to burst into flames. When Gale asked why she'd followed him inside even though she was so scared, Mora got flustered, eventually admitting that she was worried about him facing the enemies alone. They continued deeper into the more dangerous part of the dungeon, with Gale telling her to trust him. Mora agreed, and the two walked on, hand in hand. Gale really is quite the player, and it looks like this ship is starting to set sail. Before Gale and Mora left the royal capital, 4 individuals were struggling at a blacksmith shop, trying to sell their gear. It was none other than the floundering S-rank party led by Cash. The blacksmith refused to buy their filthy items, leaving them homeless and hungry. Realizing the importance of money management, the group considered taking on low-level quests to get back on their feet. Luke suggested some jobs from the guild, like exterminating low-level monsters, confronting skeleton knights, and hunting goblins. However, Cash and Melissa, in their arrogance, rejected these quests. Norris tried to calm the situation, explaining that they needed to rebuild their strength gradually. Reluctantly, the party agreed to take on a C-rank quest to fight skeleton knights. Luke and Norris provided support from the rear, while Cash and Melissa confronted the monsters head-on. However, their initial confidence was quickly shattered when the skeletons overwhelmed them, forcing the entire party to flee and fail the mission. The next day, the group tried their hand at an orc extermination quest. Let's just say they lost 1,000 aura points for their disastrous failure. As the days went by, Cash and the others grew weary, returning to the Royal Capital Guild with a string of consecutive failures and not a single successful quest to report. The constant failures weighed heavily on their spirits, leaving them dejected and clueless about what to do next. And guess what the first thing they said was? Shamelessly, they declared it was all Gale's fault. And I agree. It was totally Gale's fault. He was the one who single-handedly carried this bunch of deadweights all the way to S rank. Norris told the group their priority was to make money and then settle the score with Gale. Luke added that Gale was so pathetic, he was probably just running a roadside stall by now. Cash, meanwhile, told the guild receptionist that the quest was a scam and the monsters were much stronger than expected. On another quest, Cash reassured the villagers they had the situation under control, but when the fighting began, the villagers were mostly left to fend for themselves, while Cash and his party were soundly beaten by a mob of goblins. The guild receptionist suggested that they should voluntarily downgrade from S rank to avoid further humiliation. Cash flew into a rage at this suggestion, grabbing the receptionist by her collar But after getting thrashed by goblins and an ogre, he ended up getting schooled by a woman right then and there. It would make more sense if Cash changed his name to Trash. Meanwhile, in the underground cemetery of Farm Edge, undead creatures were swarming the place. Gale explored the deeper levels and sensed the ever-increasing density of souls, realizing the great potential of this underground cemetery. Mora closed her eyes and asked if anything was in front of them, and Gale lied, saying there was nothing there. But when she sensed the presence of numerous undead creatures, Mora immediately moved closer to him. Suddenly, a giant skeleton erupted from the ground. Gale immediately cast a dispelling spell on the bone monster, destroying it in an instant. Mora opened her eyes, surprised to see the creature had been dealt with so cleanly. Gale explained that it was quite simple, comparing it to how priests perform exorcisms. Mora disagreed, arguing that the methods weren't the same, but Gale believed that the priest's approach wasn't necessarily perfect. He began to think of a way to explain it to her, then picked up a skull, looking at it with a warm smile. Gale said that his method was about giving the undead a chance to be heard, so he could listen to their stories. After defeating the fearsome skeleton monster, Gale carefully gathered the fragments of the defeated creature, leaving no piece behind. Meanwhile, Mora, still trying to process what had just happened with a mix of surprise and curiosity, turned to Gale with a puzzled expression. She was confused by Gale's mention of listening to the stories of the undead and didn't understand how it related to the duties of a cleric. Gale gently reminded her that they needed to have a serious talk, then asked if she knew what it meant to control the dead. Mora's eyes widened in astonishment, guessing that it might be some kind of special magic or power. Her amazement grew when she saw the skeleton monster reappear on Gale's back, its eerie presence serving as a stark reminder of the mystical world they were delving into. Gale took a moment to explain further, describing the art of controlling the dead as a powerful form of magic, especially in a cemetery where the boundary between life and death is blurred. Gale explained that the undead disliked purification or exorcism, saying it was like the devil seeking baptism. From the perspective of the undead, their presence in the human world is often due to unresolved grudges and emotions. Therefore, when they are forced back to their graves, they feel unjustly reprimanded, as if their feelings and stories are being ignored. Gale tried to convey to Mora that despite their fearsome appearance, the undead also have stories and reasons to remain in the mortal world, just like anyone else. Mora, still confused, admitted to Gale that she didn't understand what he was saying at all. Undeterred, Gale continued to explain using a more relatable example. He asked Mora if she could recall any moment from her childhood when she felt unjustly scolded or ignored. Gale's words resonated with her, bringing back a vivid memory from her childhood. She recalled a time when she excitedly talked about wanting to go on adventures, only to be scolded because that's not proper for a girl. Even though she tried to give examples of female explorers, her words were dismissed due to stubborn prejudice. Mora was lost in the memory, and Gale noticed her distant gaze. He gently asked if she was okay. Mora, startled, quickly reassured him with a forced smile, saying, "It's nothing." Gale listened intently as the skeletons shared their stories, his face showing genuine contemplation. One skeleton recounted dying while hungry, wishing it could eat forever. Another said it was lonely because it had died alone. Gale chuckled softly, joking, "My only regret would probably be not buying Bitcoin." But then his tone shifted, and he explained that sometimes the strongest grudges come from being treated unfairly before death. Often, these grudges arise from the small things in daily life, the kinds of frustrations everyone experiences. With a hopeful tone, Gale suggested the simple idea that if people could just understand and accept these minor frustrations, it could make a huge difference. As Gale summoned his magic, the ground trembled and a menacing darkness began to rise from the earth. Mora was so terrified that she jumped into Gale's arms, seeking safety in his embrace. As the Black Bone Knight appeared, imposing and threatening, but Gale remained calm, his gaze steady and his voice filled with resolve, as he reassured Mora and prepared to face the approaching threat. Gale chanted again, and his magic began to take effect. The scene magically transformed as the menacing darkness around the Black Bone Knight began to dissipate. And from within the shadows, a glimmering light emerged. The darkness gave way, revealing the soul within the skeletal form. During this transformation, a young boy appeared, surrounded by flames, becoming a symbol of hope in the darkness. While Mora stared in astonishment at the miraculous sight, the young boy gradually vanished into thin air. Leaving her bewildered and speechless, Gale smiled and offered a simple explanation, suggesting the boy's fleeting appearance was just a brief encounter. Mora struggled to understand why the boy had vanished so suddenly. Patiently, Gale elaborated on his abilities. He revealed that through his experience creating cursed items and artifacts, he had gradually developed the ability to sense the emotions of spirits. He reassured Mora that he could sense when something was amiss, like the boy's unresolved regret about not being able to say goodbye to his fiancée. Mora, her curiosity growing, asked Gale for more details about his ability. Gale explained that by listening to the stories of the departed and responding appropriately, he could help them find release and peace, just as he had done before with the skeletons and their resentments. Mora reflected deeply, acknowledging that spirits sought not just guidance but also empathy, for they were once human, with their own feelings and stories. Gale nodded in agreement, remarking that genuine empathy was the key when dealing with the spirits of the dead. He explained that it wasn't simply about fulfilling their requests, but about understanding the emotions and experiences they had gone through. Gale also revealed that this approach was particularly effective for creating cursed items. By empathizing with the spirit's emotions and reacting accordingly, he could gather much higher quality materials than through the purification methods used by priests. It was a delicate balance of understanding and respect, allowing Gale to forge cursed items that held the essence of the departed while ensuring their spirits could pass on peacefully. As they continued their journey, Gale noticed a pensive expression on Mora's face. Curious about her thoughts, he gently asked her to share them. Mora hesitated for a moment before voicing her concern, questioning Gale's perspective on communicating with spirits, wondering if he considered it a simple task. After a moment's thought, Gale explained that it was neither simple nor complex, but a matter of perspective. To him, spirits were merely materials to work with, a sentiment forged from his own experiences and understanding. However, Mora couldn't accept Gale's explanation. A sense of anger flared within her, seeing his viewpoint as shallow and insensitive. In Mora's eyes, Gale's casual approach to destroying the undead and comparing their existence to mere materials to work with truly unsettled her. Her emotions surging, Mora confronted Gale, expressing her outrage at his seemingly easygoing attitude toward handling spirits. She argued that his perspective belittled the importance of the task and diminished the work of those who dedicated themselves to guiding and purifying wandering souls. Gale was scared stiff by her shouting. In fact, any guy would be terrified when confronted like that. As the tension escalated, Mora insisted that Gale owed the priests an apology. Those priests worked tirelessly to bring peace to troubled spirits and protect the sanctity of the afterlife. Gale, trying to de-escalate the situation, suggested that eliminating the undead would actually satisfy everyone, making it a win-win situation. However, Mora disagreed, realizing the issue wasn't as simple as Gale thought. She believed Gale's perspective oversimplified the complexity of the situation, which only irritated her more. As Mora voiced her concerns, her voice grew louder, leaving Gale feeling alarmed and somewhat frightened. In his heart, he realized anyone would feel overwhelmed in such a situation. Despite their disagreement, Gale and Mora continued onward, delving into the deepest part of their journey. Suddenly, from within the deep darkness, a strange light shone, bathing the area in an ethereal glow. As they ventured deeper, they encountered countless terrifying creatures, skeleton knights, undead archers, dark wraiths, and even ghouls. Gale couldn't help but wonder if there was a connection to the netherworld, a thought that sent a shiver down his spine. Mora, ever observant, commented on the large number of pale undead souls gathered in this place. She suggested their presence was the source of the eerie light that enveloped the surrounding area. Gale nodded in agreement, acknowledging Mora's logic and observation. However, he noticed something strange about her demeanor. Despite the many dangers lurking around them, she seemed unusually calm, almost too calm for the situation they were in. When Gale suggested that she shouldn't close her eyes, Mora just brushed off his concern, declaring that she was already used to the dark. But Gale couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't being entirely truthful. He sensed a hidden fear behind her calm facade, a fear she was trying to conceal. Mora was truly a clumsy liar. It was almost embarrassing to watch. Gale, a master of stealth and cunning, moved silently behind a tall pillar, his steps carefully calculated to eavesdrop on the conversation between the skeletons in the gloomy room. Meanwhile, Mora, with her unwavering perception and vigilance, began to notice Gale's subtle actions, her curious gaze following his discreet movements as he tried to avoid her suspicion. Thinking fast, Gale concocted a story on the spot, his mind racing to find a plausible reason for his secretive behavior. He shrugged nonchalantly and explained that he was just thinking about the possibility of leeches, undead sorcerers, being around, a topic that had been on his mind lately. Although Mora nodded as if she understood, a hint of suspicion remained on her face. Nevertheless, she stayed by Gale's side, all her senses on alert, ready to react to any sign of danger. As they stood in the darkness, Gale felt the atmosphere shift, a palpable tension filling the space around them. Mora, sensitive to any change in their environment, suggested they leave immediately, her instincts urging caution in the face of lurking uncertainty. Gale was torn between his desire to explore deeper and the need to ensure their safety, carefully weighing their next move. However, before they could make a decision, fate intervened with an unexpected accident. Mora's foot accidentally bumped into a nearby statue, sending it crashing to the ground with a resounding echo. In the tense silence that followed, Gale and Mora held their breath, bracing for the inevitable reaction from the skeletons inhabiting the room. Their hearts pounded in their chests. But surprisingly, the skeletons remained motionless, their strange stillness creating a mysterious atmosphere. Gale, his senses on high alert, detected a disturbance in the shadows. Someone was approaching, but who? With a silent signal, Gale motioned for Mora to find cover, all his senses sharpened, ready to face whatever formidable opponent awaited them. Suddenly, from the deep shadows, a massive figure emerged before them, a giant skeleton whose imposing figure and overwhelming power made it a force to be reckoned with. Gale's eyes locked onto the newly appeared foe, recognizing its distinct aura of authority. And a dreadful silence fell as a high-ranking sorcerer of the undead, an arch-sorcerer, entered majestically. If we'd known he was such a big shot, we would have rolled out the red carpet. Gale's heart hammered, fully aware of the arch-sorcerer's immense power. The appearance of such a terrifying being on the surface could spell doom, as it could summon an entire army of the undead with a mere thought. Scary, isn't it? The scene was like something out of an undead legend, with a horde of zombies surrounding it to amplify its dreadful power. According to legend, this arch-sorcerer could bring untold calamity upon humanity, a prospect that made Mora tremble. Her questions came in a rush, each one a desperate attempt to grasp the perilous situation they now faced. Gale, ever the voice of reason amidst the chaos, explained that a creature of such high class and power required a special strategy. Dealing with this powerful foe would require a high-ranking monk, skilled in both combat arts and spiritual power. As Gale and Mora were hastily conferring, the peace was suddenly shattered by an echoing sound. of skeletons charging toward them with malicious intent. It was time to act. Adrenaline surged through them as Gale urged Mora to run for her life, while he risked everything to unleash the ultimate power of Curse Break, a secret technique of high priests meant to dissolve the curses that bind wretched souls. In a fateful moment, the impossible happened. The high-level mage, a horrifying specter of death, began to transform. Gale and Mora watched in astonishment as his form faded, his spirit leaving the undead body, just like the fate of the young boy they had encountered. In that moment, the truth about the high-level mage was revealed. He was a creature bound by curses, suffering from the torment of his own existence. Finally, upon reaching the deepest level of the cemetery, Gale felt a wave of relief wash over him as he stepped out into the fresh air, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere underground. Beside him, Mora had tears in her eyes, her voice choked with emotion as she declared she never wanted to set foot in a cemetery again. As they paused to catch their breath, Mora reflected on the journey they had just endured, facing an army of the undead and emerging victorious in the span of a single day. It was a story that would seem unbelievable if told by someone else, but here was the living proof of their own extraordinary adventure. Gale, ever the optimist, downplayed their achievement, suggesting Mora's excitement was a bit of an overreaction. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, he couldn't deny the sense of satisfaction knowing that he had made a difference. As they stood together in the fading twilight, Mora felt a deep sense of gratitude for her strange partnership with Gale. In him, she had found a companion always ready to face the unknown, no matter how terrifying the challenge. Outside the towering walls of the royal church, Cash and his group were confronted by a stern church member, his robes flapping in the wind. As he looked them over, the church member's suspicious gaze swept across each person in the group, and the air grew heavy. Without waiting long, the cleric posed a sharp question. "Are you cursed?" His voice was deep and authoritative, demanding a satisfactory answer. Cash, unfazed by the scrutinizing gaze, met it with a determined look of his own. His voice was firm as he declared their purpose, that they had come to the royal church to have a curse, inflicted by Gale, removed. Cash emphasized the name with contempt, as if its mere mention was distasteful to him. In that moment, Cash was the very embodiment of a true Karen. Elsewhere, Princess Carla was whispering to her young companion, her brow furrowed in thought as she considered the rumors circulating around them. She asked if it was all about money, and the young girl, wise beyond her years, nodded in agreement. She believed the information came from a reliable source, a renowned adventurer from the Capital Guild. There were even whispers of recent sightings that seemed to be related to the rumors. Meanwhile, Cash and his companions entered the church, their presence immediately drawing curious glances from those around them. Cash, a keen observer, was captivated by the cathedral's carpet design, his fingers tracing the patterns like an enthralled 6-year-old. In another corner, Princess Carla's attendant silently watched Cash's group. With a pensive expression, his mind filled with thoughts about the recent disturbances. With the weight of his responsibilities upon him, he approached Princess Carla, each step deliberate, to report on the suspicious behavior of Cash and his party. A look of concern, yet determination, crossed Princess Carla's face. She looked at Cash with a steadfast gaze, as if silently asking a question that was difficult to voice. Cash responded with an enigmatic smile, his eyes hiding a mix of mystery and vulnerability. Meanwhile, Mora and Gale were asking about their next destination, when Gimli smiled and said that she was considering the Blacksmiths Guild, a gathering place for highly skilled members. The group quickly headed there to arrange a flexible spot for Gale's stall. Gale was a bit confused to find himself here instead of at the Merchants Guild, but Gimli explained that the Blacksmiths Guild held more influence in Farm Edge, even overshadowing the Merchants Guild. The Blacksmiths Guild not only attracted financial resources, but was also a hub for talented craftsmen. Therefore, they needed to try and build loyalty and trust with the Blacksmiths Guild. With all this information about the different guilds, Gale's head was spinning. However, he understood that in an agricultural city like Farm Edge, iron products were incredibly valuable. The Blacksmiths Guild not only handled repairs, but also produced new tools, and they possessed a deep understanding of the tools needed for different types of soil. Being locals, they could provide agricultural tools specifically designed to suit the soil and weather conditions. It was this expertise and diverse supply that made the Blacksmiths Guild an attractive destination for everyone here. Gale realized that greeting the most influential person in the Blacksmiths Guild would help him secure a prime location for his stall. Gimli nodded and asked if they had brought any souvenirs. The idea of souvenirs excited Gale, while Mora had a bad feeling about it, which was understandable. Gale took out a cursed necklace and a splintered object teeming with cursed energy, terrifying everyone nearby. Mora was furious that he would bring such items to a crowded place. Luckily, Gimli had led them to a few shops to buy souvenirs along the way, so Mora decided she would be the one to handle the gift-giving. Under Gimli's guidance, they entered the guild and witnessed the diligence of the blacksmiths at work. The space was filled with large iron tools and forges. The heat was palpable to both Gale and Mora. There was no reception desk here. It felt more like an artisan's workshop than a guild. When she realized that, Gale wasn't used to speaking loudly. Mora stepped forward and tried to talk to someone, but no one responded. Gimli explained that due to the high level of noise, they couldn't hear her. Mora demonstrated just how loud they needed to shout. She called out Sharina's name in a powerful voice. That startled Gale and Mora. The sound cut through the noisy space and caught everyone's attention. Suddenly, a large hammer flew toward them, but both of them managed to dodge it just in time. Sharina appeared, scolding Gimli for being so loud so early in the morning. Sharina was a dwarven girl with short hair and a somewhat stubborn attitude. Gale and Mora were surprised to learn she was the one they were here to see. Gimli blamed Sharina for not responding when they had called for her earlier. The two exchanged some playful banter, making Mora wonder if there was some tension between elves and dwarves. Gimli dismissed her concern and introduced Sharina as the guildmaster of the Forging Guild and the most influential person in Farm Edge. Sharina greeted them warmly and extended her hand for a handshake. As Gale shook her hand, he noticed how large her hands were compared to her body, covered in small scars from her forging work, with thick arms and scorched skin, a testament to her long experience in the craft. Mora glanced back and forth between Sharina and Gale and finally asked why he was being so quiet. Meanwhile, Gale and Sharina both felt a sense of similarity from the simple handshake, and both broke into wide smiles. As they realized they were both master-class artisans, Gimli interrupted, teasing them for staring at each other. They both quickly let go of their hands and denied having any weird thoughts. Mora felt a bit awkward and coughed to change the subject. Gimli then asked Sharina if Gale, who had just arrived from the royal capital, could open a stall in town. Sharina responded nonchalantly, saying Gale could set up a stall wherever he wanted because she didn't care. Sharina explained that the Forging Guild was currently short on materials, which had kept her busy since morning, and she didn't want to waste time on unnecessary things like Gimli's request. After hearing the full story from Gimli, Sharina realized that starting a stall without permission could cause trouble with the merchant guilds. While Sharina respected their honorable approach to handling things, she had no intention of interfering in the town's affairs. Sharina shared that, unlike in the royal capital, she focused on repairing and reusing items instead of throwing them away. She'd been fixing things for others as part of her work, and before she knew it, she had become the face of the blacksmiths guild in town. Sharina sat down and asked for Gale's name, advising him not to pay too much attention to what Gimli said, and calling Gimli a suspicious elf girl, which led to a small argument between them. In the end, Sharina agreed to write a letter of introduction for Gale. Gale was delighted, and he and Mora jumped up to celebrate. Sharina interrupted and said she was just kidding, that things weren't that easy. Sharina suggested a bartering method to get permission, stating that they needed to show the proper sincerity. Gale didn't quite understand what she meant, but Mora immediately pulled out a bottle of local fire liquor that she had brought as a gift. Sharina was about to accept the gift from Mora, but Gale suddenly interrupted, insisting that he had also brought a special gift. Mora quickly pulled him back and reminded him that he didn't need to contribute anything. But Gale was adamant that Sharina would love the sword he brought. Gale was annoyed at how strict Mora was being with him. Sharina's eyes were drawn to Gale's sword, and she began to get curious. She moved closer to inspect it, and astonishment was clear on her face. This sword was truly a masterpiece, crafted with incredible skill, and just a single glance, Sharina could tell that this was no ordinary sword. They immediately sensed a kinship between fellow artisans. Gale was so happy to see someone who truly understood and appreciated the value of his creation that his eyes began to sparkle. Sharina told him there was no need for formalities, and Gale could tell she was a true master of her craft. He shared how overjoyed he was to meet someone who truly understood the value of his work. Mora and Gimli watched on, trying to comfort him in his emotional state. While Sharina couldn't help but admire the sword's construction, she seemed pleased, which made Mora feel a little jealous. She cleared her throat again to get Sharina's attention, and Gimli caught on. Sharina remarked that she had a blacksmith at her shop who could inspect the sword more thoroughly, but she could already tell that it must be a rare monster drop. She loved the enchantments on the sword and discovered it had blood-draining, sharpness-enhancing, and darkness properties. When Gale proudly mentioned there was one more effect, Sharina realized it also had a lightness attribute, making it easy to carry and swing with agility. Mora was amazed at Sharina's ability to discern all that, something that even she, a mage, couldn't do. This sword was truly ideal for a party's vanguard swordsman. Sharina excitedly swung the sword a few times, before finally remarking that its wielder could probably fight solo without needing a party. Gale agreed and added that the sword also had magic resistance, dust resistance, and it was cursed. Sharina liked the magic and dust resistance features, but she froze when she heard the word cursed. Immediately, the curse activated and wrapped itself around her arm. Seeing her panic, Gale looked a little disappointed and quickly reassured her that he could easily remove the curse. Furious, Sharina called him an idiot for not mentioning such a crucial detail earlier, taking back all her previous praise. Meanwhile, Gimli just stood by, watching everything unfold with amusement. She could tell the enchantments on the sword were truly amazing, and knew that if it weren't cursed, Sharina would have been thoroughly impressed. Watching Gale handle the curse so skillfully, Gimli realized he was an exceptional curse artisan and was probably the same one from that story she'd heard about the princess. While disinfecting herself, Sharina changed her mind and decided not to allow Gale to open a stall. Gale protested, saying he'd worked very hard to create the sword she had just insulted. Sharina retorted that if he kept selling cursed tools like this, the town would be ruined. After a moment of silence, she said she wasn't that heartless and asked if he really wanted to open a stall that badly. Gale bowed his head, asking for permission, partly urged on by Mora, and begged Sharina to let him open the stall. Mora also apologized on Gale's behalf, saying that while he could be eccentric, he had his good qualities. Mora got straight to the point and asked Sharina what she wanted in return. Sharina said she wouldn't ask for money from a newcomer, but she wanted them to do something for her instead. She explained that there was a mine called the Soul Mine in Farm Edge, and she needed someone to take on the mission of exterminating the monsters that had made a nest there. However, Sharina warned that this was no ordinary mission. Anyone who had ever set foot in the Soul Mine had gone missing, and to this day, they still didn't know what had happened or what kind of monster was responsible. Mora and Gale never thought they would have to face such a difficult mission. Sharina looked at them with a scrutinizing gaze and asked if they were prepared to secure the Anunnaki mine. Meanwhile, in the imperial capital, Carla was utterly shocked by the news from Vivian. She had thought the assassination attempt against her might have been the work of someone merely pretending to be from the Empire, but it turned out the Empire itself was behind it. Carla refused to believe it, but Vivian insisted the information was accurate, as she had tortured the assassins for their confession. The reason for the assassination was a succession dispute within the Empire. The Empire's first prince was the one who hired assassins to kill the princess. The first prince wanted to do this because the emperor was bedridden with illness, and a tense struggle for succession had broken out between the first prince, who was the son of a concubine, and the second prince, the son of the empress. Carla asked why she was involved in all of this, and Vivian explained that while she wasn't directly involved, they couldn't ignore the fact that Carla had been chosen as the fiancée of the Empire's second prince. Carla suddenly became despondent, as if she'd forgotten all about it. She didn't want to be forced into a marriage like that, but her steward reminded her that this was a commitment between nations, something beyond her personal wishes. Needless to say, the eldest prince's faction wasn't happy about the second prince marrying Carla, as it would strengthen his position. In other words, the marriage between Carla and the second prince was nothing but an obstacle for the eldest prince. As things stood, there was nothing to stop it. The eldest prince, even if his actions were exposed, could still take advantage of the Empire's current turmoil. Since the Empire wasn't unified, two strategies would likely be used to deal with this situation. First, the second prince could use the assassination attempt as a pretext to move against the eldest prince, creating goodwill for the Empire. Additionally, there's a chance another assassin will be sent, according to the information Vivian got from the previous assassins. Vivian stated that if the kingdom kept insisting that the Empire was denying the incident and taking no action, it would only cause trouble for Carla unless she wanted to go to war with them. Carla grew tired after hearing about all these schemes, declared the engagement offer, and looked at the ring Gale had given her. Back at Farm Edge, Gale, Mora, Gimli, and Sharina arrived at the Anunnaki mine. They quickly realized that none of them were skilled in combat. Gale reminded Sharina that she should have hired more party members for this quest. Sharina retorted that this was exactly why the quest had been sitting there for so long. No one would take it. Sharina explained that the quest was originally C rank. But since no one had completed it all this time, it had been raised to AAA rank. After their usual bickering, everyone calmed down and discussed how to approach the quest from here. Gale understood that if they didn't complete this quest, the difficulty would increase to S rank. They looked at the mine and felt a chill as a faint sound echoed out, at first thinking it might just be the wind. However, Gale sensed the presence of an extremely dangerous monster inside. Sharina immediately spoke up, calling them cowards and asking what they were so afraid of. She reminded them of the resolve of adventurers, while she would be acquiring more weapons from these mines since they couldn't be mined yet. The group looked back at the quest notice, remembering that no one who entered this mine had ever come back. On top of that, the reward for the quest wasn't much, only 10 gold coins. Sharina explained that since the quest previously had a low difficulty, the reward was also low. Mora reasoned that if the quest reward was low, it was understandable why no one wanted to take it. Gale added that they would have a hard time without a vanguard to lead the way. Mora reminded him he once defeated an entire army commanded by a sorcerer all by himself. But Gale replied that was because they were just undead. He wasn't sure he could defeat some unknown monster. Sharina, tired of the complaints, stepped forward and offered to be their vanguard. Mora and Gale were stunned by this proposal, but Sharina had no problem taking on the role, even though they were concerned for her safety. Gimli spoke up, asserting that it was perfectly fine for Sharina to be the vanguard. Meanwhile, Mora felt uneasy, knowing their party was completely unbalanced with a curse user, a support mage, and a blacksmith. However, she believed that Gale's creations would be useful. Determined to finish the quest quickly so Gale could open his stall in a prime location thanks to Sharina's permission, they entered the mine while Gimli wished them luck on their challenging journey. Sharina informed the group that there were many ventilation shafts in the mine, And when the wind blew through them, it made a sound like a howling dog. They also came across many different types of rock, like iron ore and mithril ore. When everything seemed peaceful, everyone relaxed. But just then, Mora spotted something up ahead. She squinted into the darkness and saw a terrifying face appear, causing her to scream in terror. She called out to Gale, saying there was an undead ahead. Of course, Gale got excited hearing the word undead. But when they took a closer look, it turned out to be just a stone statue. Sharina saw the statue and noted that the craftsmanship on it was incredibly detailed, as if it were alive. She and Gale were both impressed with the craftsmanship on the statue. However, Mora, the only one who remained clear-headed, looked around and noticed something. She quickly pulled her two dazed friends back and made them observe their surroundings. The group was horrified to discover that there wasn't just one, but a whole series of other stone statues, all looking lifelike with various expressions. Sharina stared at one particular statue, suddenly speechless. She insisted that she recognized the face in the statue. It was one of the adventurers from Farm Edge. Sharina's face went pale, and she tried to understand how they could have been turned into statues like this. Guile took Sharina's hand and said that this was clearly the work of some kind of monster. Knowing the monster must be nearby, the group immediately went on high alert. Mora reminded everyone to keep an eye on all directions. Gale had a bad feeling, since only a few special types of monsters had this ability. Mora figured it must be an A-rank monster or higher, possibly a basilisk. After carefully observing their surroundings, Gale began to pick up the scent of a cockatrice, a half-snake, half-chicken creature lurking somewhere nearby. There were feathers scattered about, a clear sign that only a cockatrice could be responsible for turning things to stone. It was a creature with formidable defenses, capable of deflecting normal weapons with its sharp talons and dangerous beak, along with a venomous bite. But its most terrifying feature was its breath, which could petrify anything. Gale told Mora to move to the back with him, while he tried to come up with a plan. His curse could slow the enemy, which would be Sharina's cue to use her great hammer to unleash a barrage of blows, striking the cockatrice and sending the monster flying into the air. Both Mora and Gale were stunned to see this 5-hit mid-air combo. They asked Gale about the powerful darts he used, and he casually revealed that he had once used the Grim Reaper as crafting material for them. Mora grabbed him by the collar and scolded him. Because what sane person just casually says, "Oh, the Grim Reaper. He was annoying, so I turned him into darts." But then she realized the fight wasn't over, as they had only defeated the chicken part of the monster. Immediately, Mora cast a muscle enhancement spell on Sharina, getting her ready to fight the snake part of the creature as it prepared to lunge at them. Sharina jammed her hammer into the snake's mouth, then grabbed it by both its head and tail. "Now, let me show you the power of a first-class blacksmith," she said, and then brutally ripped the snake in half, finishing it off. And with that, the S-rank quest was complete. Mora wondered why this chicken was hanging around in a place like this. Gale calmly replied that it probably mistook the mine for a chicken coop. Just then, under Mora's foot, a piece of an eggshell cracked, and from the darkness, an army of chicks appeared. The flock of chicks erupted into a riot, and the three of them immediately started running for their lives. Thanks to Mora's enhancement magic, Sharina created a pile of chick corpses around them. But the problem remained, because there were still far too many chicks, leaving Gale, Mora, and Sharina to face a relentless mob. Gale tried to figure out a way to deal with them, but the cursed tools he had relied on before were ineffective against these weak creatures. A sense of desperation began to set in, and the three of them grew more anxious. As the chicks grew more aggressive, Mora and Gale stood back, while Sharina tried to hold her ground and prevent the chicks from getting closer. Mora realized they needed to target the chicks and asked Gale if he had any useful items. Gale searched through his pile of cursed items, filtering out things that might help. He looked disappointed and said all he had left were items for interior decorating. If Gale himself said that, it could only mean they were boss-level items. Gale found a cursed headband, a shadow mask, and the wailing breath horn, and nonchalantly said the items were just for decoration, and their effects were negligible. After downplaying his own creations, he casually listed that they only tripled defense, doubled speed, granted fatigue resistance, and provided poison immunity. Both Mora and Sharina were shocked and annoyed by Gale's absurd cluelessness, probably wanting to call him a few choice words. Sharina, who had been holding the front line, immediately abandoned her post and rushed over to Gale. She declared that those very enhancements were exactly what they needed right now. Mora put up a defensive wall so Sharina could safely equip the items without danger. Gale reminded her that these items weren't meant for combat, so she shouldn't complain. Sharina took a closer look at the headband's design and almost gagged when she saw it was covered in tiny, dense holes, which reminded her of something terrifying. But she had to tell herself that design aesthetics were probably never Gale's strong suit. Sharina, fully aware of the urgent situation and understanding their need for increased attack power, put on the cursed headband to triple her defense and reduce fatigue. Along with the shadow mask, which improved her night vision and granted poison immunity, she felt a surge of power course through her as her fatigue vanished instantly. The only negative was that wearing these items made her look like an absolute clown. Gale handed her the final item, the wailing breath horn, with the ability to double her speed and quintuple her strength. Sharina's new set of gear was now complete, and she felt invincible. If Gimli were here, she would probably be laughing her head off. Meanwhile, Gale watched Sharina with the proud look of a father as she felt the explosive power surging through her fingertips. The defensive wall behind Sharina cracked, and for a moment, it seemed she wouldn't be able to dodge the attack in time. Surprisingly, not only did she dodge, but she also spun around, swinging her hammer with incredible force, taking down multiple chicks in a single blow. It all happened in a matter of seconds. Gale's eyes sparkled with admiration, while Mora wondered if this was even the same Sharina they knew. Sharina unleashed a new skill and named it Infinity Reversal as she displayed her phenomenal power and began to laugh maniacally. Mora worriedly asked Gale if there was any danger from the cursed tools, but he explained it was just a combination of normal effects and a new, more powerful effect born from the interaction between the different cursed artifacts. Sharina had reached a state of absolute euphoria and delivered the finishing blow to the last chick. After the battle was over, she threw off the items, calling them junk with a look of disgust. Her fatigue and stress had been accumulating, even though the cursed items created an illusion of strength. Like a karmic backlash, the moment the items were removed, she was instantly overwhelmed by exhaustion and collapsed to the ground, unable to move. It was a reminder to everyone that without Gale's cursed tools, no matter how ugly they were nothing. Mora checked on Sharina and realized that the damage she had taken during the fight was now ravaging her body. Gale suggested they should rest, as the pain would lessen over time. Sharina lay motionless on the ground like a corpse, while Mora and Gale praised her for fighting bravely. Mora was also exhausted and needed to rest. After a moment, Sharina announced that the quest to defend the Inunaki mines, with a AA difficulty rating, was finally complete. They celebrated their victory together. Laughing cheerfully, Mora expressed regret for venturing into such a dangerous place without knowing about the cockatrice nest. Gale and Sharina felt the same, wishing they had stayed away from this place from the start. But it seemed that whenever they thought they had completed their mission and began to celebrate, fate had a way of throwing new troubles at them. Suddenly, Gale felt uneasy about the situation. The phrase cockatrice nest was like a warning bell. It was the same feeling he'd had when he discovered the hatched eggs. He suddenly realized that there was still another cockatrice nearby. Unfortunately, another cockatrice appeared right in front of them, larger and more aggressive. They realized this was the male, and the one they had killed earlier was just the female. The male attacked immediately, forcing them to dodge in an instant. Now they understood why this mine had given previous adventurers so much trouble. Sharina noticed that this male had even more snakes attached to its body. The monster was so enraged that it threw a cow at them. Perhaps one it had brought back for its chicks, which were now dead thanks to the trio. Sharina quickly raised her hammer and skillfully blocked the incoming boulder. She encouraged the other two to hold on a little longer, reminding them that she was just as tired as they were. The male was furious because its family was dead, but Sharina had her own reason to be angry. She declared that this mine was the territory of the Blacksmiths Guild, and no chicken would be allowed to run wild in here. Since the cockatrice dared to trespass on their territory, it would have to face Sharina's wrath first. She charged towards the cockatrice, but Gale noticed a strange mist coming from the monster's mouth. He quickly chased after her and pulled her back just in time, stopping her from entering the mist's range. He said that he had only ever heard rumors about this petrification breath. Until today, the cockatrice was still raging, spewing out continuous clouds of mist. Gale explained that anything that touched the mist would turn to stone. This was the weapon that had defeated all the other adventurers. Gale and Sharina were doing their best to distract the enemy, while Mora struggled to analyze the mist. She realized its range was short and the speed of its spray was slow. She tried to find an escape route, but the entire area was sealed off by the petrifying mist. Before she could think of a plan, she was horrified to see Gale and Sharina rushing towards her at full speed. Mora screamed in fear, telling them not to come any closer, but it was clear Gale and Sharina had no other choice. Just then, one of the cockatrice's snakes attacked them, and they ducked just in time, causing the snake to smash into the stone wall behind them, shattering it to pieces. Once again, a feeling of despair washed over them, as they realized there was no stone wall left for defense, and Sharina's hammer was also gone. They had nothing to shield themselves from the next petrifying breath. Just then, Sharina spoke up, saying that if they needed a shield, she would become one for them. They tried to stop her, but the cockatrice was about to attack again, and there was no time to think. Sharina quickly stood between them and the cockatrice, spreading her arms wide, telling them to stay in her shadow. When Mora started crying, Sharina reminded her that she was the front line and that it was her duty to protect them. The cockatrice unleashed its petrifying breath, and a mist enveloped Sharina's body, causing her to begin petrifying. Sharina's final words were that no matter how strange Gale was, she could never bring herself to hate him. She also asked them to take care of the members of the Blacksmiths Guild, especially Gimli, hoping that she would do well. She regretted not getting the chance to tell Gimli this herself. In a moment of desperation, Gale reached out and cast a curse to spell. Sharina's body suddenly glowed, and the petrification curse was broken. Sharina emerged from danger, safe and sound. Gale awkwardly scratched his head and grinned widely, saying he just had a hunch he could break the petrification curse. If he weren't the main character protected by plot armor, Mora and Sharina would have probably beaten him to a pulp in their rage. Mora and Sharina were speechless as Gale apologized, saying he hadn't realized a Gorgon's and a cockatrice's petrifying breath were so similar. He went on to explain that a Gorgon is a female monster with snakes for hair, and anyone who looks into its eyes will be turned to stone. Gale also explained that curses weren't limited to undead or demon-type monsters, but could also be found in beasts. He was excited by this discovery, finding it fascinating that petrification could be caused by a type of venom. Sharina, with a hint of sarcasm, pointed a finger at the cockatrice, which was panting from exhaustion and shaking its head. This meant that the petrification attack had drained its stamina as well. Mora realized that if Gale could nullify the petrifying breath, they had nothing to fear. She immediately decided they needed to counterattack before the beast could recover. Mora sensed she had enough energy for a buffing spell and decided to strengthen Sharina. They came up with a plan. Sharina would pin down the serpent body, while Gale would deliver the finishing blow to the cockatrice's head with his ridiculously powerful cursed weapon. Without a moment's hesitation, they charged forward with resolve. The snakes instantly lunged at them, But Sharina parried the snake's attacks with nothing but her fists and quickly recoiled, using the momentum from her strike to knock both snakes down. The opening came as the cockatrice prepared to strike, and Gale swiftly moved in, bypassing the snakes. Sharina yelled for him to give it everything he had, and Gale took that literally. He decided to put the cockatrice to sleep for good by using every single cursed tool he had. Gale rattled off a list of all the random curses he was about to unleash on the beast, hoping at least one of them would work. The cursed items he was about to deploy had various deadly effects, including potent toxins. He excitedly dubbed the attack with a long-winded name like Ultimate Close Quarters Multi-Curse Assault, creating a shower of curses that enveloped the monster. The cockatrice tried to fight back, but was pinned down by the cursed items from multiple angles. Sharina asked if Gale had really used everything, and he nodded proudly, saying he didn't know which would work on a boss-level monster, so he used them all. Mora grew worried when she heard him say that, and just then, all the curses began to activate simultaneously. She called him an idiot for doing something so reckless, knowing that if all his cursed tools activated at once, it could be catastrophic. He just laughed and told her she was overreacting. But then the items began to glow brighter than ever. Without warning, a massive explosion erupted, sending all three of them flying. The important thing was that the cockatrice had been obliterated. But as the dust settled, Sharina was the first to her feet. Mora was annoyed at being covered in mud, while Gailey was lying face down on the ground in a comical pose. They were about to scold him for his carelessness, but then they realized the nightmare wasn't over. The entire area began to tremble, and soon rocks started to fall from above. The three of them scrambled to escape Model as large boulders came crashing down. They tried to run back the way they came, rushing past the petrified adventurers, but tragically, there was no time to stop and help them. They kept running until they finally made it out of the mine. Gale and Mora breathed a sigh of relief, just glad to be alive. But Sharina was furious and decked each of them with a punch. The irony was that she was the one who gave this mission to two non-combat newbies in the first place. And now, she was raging at them. She was just like the old members of Gale's former party. Sharina berated them for blowing up the entire mine when their mission was simply to slay the monster. Gale innocently asked if their actions counted as an accomplishment, but Sharina was quick to shut him down. Mora argued that they had completed the mission, so they deserved a reward. This only made Sharina even angrier, and she declared that she was the one who needed compensation for the damages to the Blacksmith Guild's mine. Gale was only concerned with getting a spot to open his stall, and he reminded Sharina she'd promised to pull some strings for him. Mora chimed in, stressing that they had risked their lives for this mission and deserved to be rewarded. Sharina shot back, arguing that she was the one who had risked the most and refused to introduce them to the other members. Sharina declared that they'd be hated by everyone once word got out about the mine explosion. She insisted that she had suffered the most, from having to wear cursed gear and losing her precious hammer, to now losing the entire mine. Let's just conveniently forget that other adventurers might have been turned to dust inside the cave. Meanwhile, not far from the mine, someone was slowly emerging from an underground escape route. She thought she was going to die in that cave, but luckily, she made it out safely. It was Gimli, who had been secretly tailing the group to observe the power of Gale's cursed creations. Even though she realized that following Gale was far more dangerous than she'd anticipated, Gimli had to admit that what she saw was worth the risk. The phenomenal power Gale displayed through his cursed items presented a huge opportunity for her plans. She now understood that even if Gale could only create cursed items, their power far surpassed that of any artifact she had ever encountered. The trio returned to the cave after the chaos had died down. Thanks to another case of plot armor, all the stone statues were still intact, perhaps because they were more durable than expected. Gale approached one of the stone statues and cast a curse-breaking spell. To everyone's surprise, the spell worked, and the statue turned back into a flesh-and-blood adventurer. The adventurer, whose name was Charlie, tearfully embraced his wife, Penelope, and thanked Gale and Mora from the bottom of his heart for reuniting him with his beloved. Gale, in his typical fashion, immediately asked if they wanted to buy a special charm at a discount. Inviting them to stop by his shop later, Sharina couldn't take it anymore and chewed Gale out, telling him not to peddle his cursed wares during such a touching moment. Meanwhile, Gimli heard a knock at the door and rolled her eyes when she saw it was Sharina. The two sat down to talk, and Sharina took out one of Gale's darts, asking Gimli to examine it. Gimli used her analysis monocle to get a clear look at the dart's properties, and was so stunned she couldn't believe her eyes. She couldn't believe an item like this even existed. Sharina confirmed that it was indeed a valuable artifact, even though she had first thought it was a gag item. Sharina asked Gimli why Gale was handing these things out like they were on clearance. Gimli had no idea what was going through that man's head either. Sharina revealed that Gale had managed to save everyone who had been petrified. The church had already given up on them, but Gale's curse-breaking spell freed them from their petrified state. Sharina explained that back in the now-restored mine, more adventurers were being found, either partially eaten or petrified by the cockatrices. She realized Gale's curse-breaking ability wasn't normal, since he showed no signs of fatigue or strain even after using it repeatedly. Sharina decided to head back to the Blacksmith's Guild for a while, remarking that while Gale's skills were the real deal, the man completely lacked common sense. Gimli agreed, reminding Sharina that there were no rules against adventurers joining other guilds. The two shared a laugh, but then quickly looked away from each other upon realizing the awkwardness. Meanwhile, Gale and Mora were helping the other guild members clean up the mine. Mora told him that he was either a hero for saving the petrified people or a vandal for causing the mine to collapse. After a moment's hesitation, she asked him if he would join the Blacksmith's Guild. Gale confirmed that he was now a member of both the Adventurers Guild and the Blacksmith's Guild. Sharina had told him he needed to join the Blacksmith's Guild to get a spot for his stall. Mora called it a rare case, as the Blacksmith's Guild was usually just for blacksmiths, and it was unusual for them to let an adventurer join. She asked him what he was doing for the guild, and he replied that he was just borrowing a corner of it to create cursed tools. Mora praised him for being so widely recognized, but he wasn't so sure about that. No matter how many cursed tools he made, he still felt that none of them were actually any good. He decided to just focus on making interior decorations. He showed her one of them, called the white bone vase, and it immediately sent a shiver down Mora's spine when she saw it covered in skulls and flowers. Our boy could definitely attract a real goth with these weird items, she thought. Gale explained that the vase allowed for continuous mana recovery and increased healing speed. Mora tried to explain to Gale the rarity and true value of the items he created, but in the end she gave up. Just then Sharina appeared, who, as usual, started criticizing Gale's wares. She handed him a bag containing the head of a cockatrice so that he could claim his reward from the Adventurers Guild. She also gave him a monster's mist-generating organ so he could use it to create more cursed tools. Gale's joy seemed immeasurable, and Sharina smiled, saying that before he used any of it, she was going to teach him about the concept of supply and demand, because he needed to stop giving away everything he made for free. She stressed that he was selling missiles for the price of candy, which made Gale brace himself for a boring economics lecture, making him think that maybe he should have just stayed with his old party. Meanwhile, the second prince, Burial, was torturing the leader of the assassination squad for failing to assassinate Princess Carla. He threatened to throw her soul into the most cursed artifact they possessed, the Demon King's heart. In a final chance to save her own life, the assassin leader revealed that the princess possessed a mysterious item that could resurrect her even after instant death. She also claimed to know the identity of the person who had given the princess that item. While Gale was learning the basics of business, death seemed to be lurking just around the corner in a tavern. This was where adventurers from all over the capital gathered. Cash, Luke, Melissa, and Norris were doing what they did best, being pathetic. Cash slammed his beer mug on the table and wondered aloud if Gale had really gone to some farming town. Melissa and Norris told him to keep his voice down, lest someone overhear and snatch the bounty for Gale before they could. This brainless crew still couldn't believe that the rumor about a carriage passing through Oryx unharmed had anything to do with Gale. Cash, in his typically rude and obnoxious manner, bellowed for the waitress. When she arrived, he aggressively slammed his hand on the table, arrogantly ordering her to bring him beer and a whole cask of wine. Luke warned Cash that he shouldn't be so over the top, and asked if they should really believe the story about the carriage. The group wondered if the rumors were just rumors, because it was unbelievable that a tanker could take down a horde of orcs. Even if it were true, the person who defeated the orcs single-handedly must have been incredibly strong. Cash dismissed it all, saying there'd be no point in partying up if a single tanker could do that much. Luke asked him to be patient and hear the rest of the story, and recounted that those who described the tanker in the rumors spoke of an incredibly flashy outfit, a completely tasteless dagger, and wiping out a horde of orcs with some kind of artifact. He suggested that these details sounded a bit like Gale. Cash immediately dismissed the idea, insisting that Gale could never pull something like that off. He reminded everyone how much they struggled with just one orc. So how could Gale possibly defeat a whole mob? He was certain it had to be someone else. Luke tried to continue the story, but Melissa cut in, claiming that she'd met some witnesses who were connected to Gale. Cash immediately told her to go on. Melissa confirmed that Gale had indeed opened a stall in the market and was selling cursed items for incredibly cheap prices. Melissa said that Gale had claimed the items were just interior decorations and were completely tasteless. But for some reason, the royal guard confiscated all of them from everyone. Cash found this amusing and figured the items must have been junk, which is why everyone was complaining. Cash was furious to learn that Gale still made a decent profit from his sales. Norris continued his story, saying he had met some regulars who had seen Gale at a high-end inn and had even bought new items. Luke pieced the details together and realized this meant Gale must have earned enough to hire a carriage. He added that the royal army was also looking for Gale, so they must have searched every nook and cranny of the city. Because of that, Gale earning so much money might have led him to leave the city and start a new life elsewhere. Cash then asked what their final conclusion was from all of this. Norris replied that Gale might have changed his route to get further away from the capital. And though this was just a guess, they were surprised by the possibility that Gale had already left. They remembered that Gale was a truly free spirit, who could easily do something like set up a cursed item shop somewhere else. They recalled that Gale always had plenty of cursed items on hand, so opening a stall with enough inventory to sell was entirely possible. Every new detail they uncovered just made Cash more bitter about Gale's success. Melissa revealed that she had also visited the Merchants Guild in the capital and learned that Gale had gone there to open a stall. Although the merchant was hesitant to share details, he admitted that he had met Gale, but didn't know where Gale was now or what he was doing. Luke suggested that Gale seemed very confident in his business, so he probably went to another city to start fresh. These details made Cash feel like his head was about to explode. As his drink ran dry, he shouted for a server to bring more. Cash was confident about paying for it, since all the expenses were being charged to Princess Carla's treasury, so he planned to drink his fill. A server arrived, but to everyone's surprise, she was effortlessly carrying 2 large barrels of beer and slammed them down on the table before walking away. Cash yelled at her to serve him properly, but she just walked away silently like a true queen. Turns out the server was an assassin named Liznette. She took off her wig and pouted as her comrades praised her for putting up with Cash. Liznette was trying to eavesdrop on the group's conversation about Gale to gather intel for her mission. The others asked if she was sure about these people. Liznette replied that she had heard about a group called the Wolf Pack, who had a terrible attitude and connections to both the princess and the creator of the cursed items. She had confirmed all of this by eavesdropping. When asked how they would track Gale, Liznette scratched her head in frustration and admitted she wasn't sure what to do. To her, Gale was an extremely cunning guy, since he'd managed to keep his whereabouts hidden from everyone. Who would have guessed Gale was actually surviving with only 1.5 brain cells working? Liznette stated that the only information they had on Gale was his weird style. She said that no matter how much intel they gathered on him, it was useless, because he was a schemer who used various strategies to leave scattered clues to confuse others and hide his true identity. Meanwhile, our poor protagonist was probably getting the basics of economics beaten into him by Sharina. Liznette decided that tailing the wolf pack, who were desperately searching for Gale, was their best bet to get closer to him. She figured it was worth listening in on all of their conversations. Her plan was to stick close to the wolf pack until they found Gale, and then she would capture him. The assassins returned to their temp job at the tavern, while Liznette whispered curses about Gaul, calling him a despicable person. She would probably be utterly shocked to learn that, contrary to her beliefs, Gale was actually just a clueless rabbit hopping through a meadow, spreading joy and kindness everywhere. The thought of him doing something evil and cunning was as likely as a penguin trying to fly. Meanwhile, in the deepest part of the Blacksmith's Guild in Farm Edge, Mora entered Gale's room while he was working. She just stood there, watching him work diligently, and then he suddenly turned to her and said that he should thank her more properly. He was grateful to her for always supporting him and sticking by his side during every quest. Mora, flustered by his sincere thanks, quickly added more about herself, claiming to be one of the top 5 support mages in the capital. Sharina walked in and saw that Gale had just finished a cursed item. This time it looked truly impressive, even though Gale himself thought the opposite. She asked how to use the curse tool, and Gale explained that you just had to turn the knob on it, and a petrification beam would instantly shoot out. To demonstrate, Gale tested it by firing the petrification beam right over Sharina's head, which nearly made her faint from fear. He wasn't sure if the item would be popular, but Sharina explained that the petrification gun was actually designed to meet the needs of the people in Farm Edge. Somehow, Sharina pulled a whiteboard out of nowhere and had Gale recall that the surrounding area was mostly grasslands, mountains, and forests, making it difficult for them to acquire stone. After an hour-long lecture about supply and demand, she proposed that it would be convenient to have a machine that could produce venom men to deal with insects and other pests. To Sharina's surprise, Gale calmly revealed that he could create such a thing if she wanted. The only problem was that the materials to make it were quite rare, but that's where Gimli could help. Thrilled to have another order, Gale immediately got to work. Meanwhile, Sharina took the petrification gun to test its capabilities, while also admitting to Mora that she was glad they both felt comfortable here. Meanwhile, on the Wolfpack's side, Liznette and her team of assassins asked Cash to join their group as they prepared to depart by carriage for the agricultural city. Cash was drunk off his ass and laughing gleefully. He and his group had been happily shopping to their heart's content, with the bill covered by the royal palace. Cash had bought himself a mithril sword worth as much as 500 gold coins, while the others had also acquired items like a wyvern bone dagger, a new grimoire, and a suit of armor made from the hide of a magical beast. Cash was now confident that it didn't matter whether he was cursed by Gale or not, because with this equipment, he believed he could take on anything. The other assassins, now posing as adventurers in the group, were getting tired of listening to their meaningless boasts. Cash looked at Liznette with contempt and called her the gloomy woman, asking what she and her group planned to do on this mission. Liznette forced a smile, explaining that her role was to provide rear support for the S-rank party, the Wolf Pack, by providing buffs and debuffs. She added that she and her comrades would be in charge of carrying the equipment and supplies. Cash burst out laughing and declared that he hired them for that exact purpose, and that they'd better follow his orders. Cash pitied them for having to bring them along to the agricultural city, and expected their undying gratitude. Liznette forced a smile while seething with rage, harboring the intent to kill Cash the moment the mission was over. Everything, from the lavish food and drinks to other supplies, was put on Princess Carla's tab, so Cash simply enjoyed himself to the fullest. Liesnet reminded Cash of his second mission to escort the caravan to Farm Edge Village and advised everyone not to drink too much until they arrived. Proper and Stupid might as well have been Cash's middle names, as he immediately told Liesnet to shut up and mocked her gloomy face, which he claimed was ruining the taste of his booze. Liesnet's anger only grew with Cash's taunts, but there was little she could do since they had to rely on him for the time being. She was annoyed by the fact that assassins were often short on cash because they had to spend a lot traveling to distant places and gathering information for the court. The other assassins were also irritated that Cash had no intention of sharing any food with them. Just then, the driver blew a warning whistle, alerting everyone to danger. Liesnet and the other assassins in the carriage immediately understood the signal and quickly stepped outside to assess the situation. The driver warned everyone about monsters appearing around them, and they all quickly got into position to defend the caravan. Although they could sense the monsters, they couldn't yet see where they were. Suddenly, the ground in the forest began to shake as the sound of rushing monsters surrounded the area. An alliance of various monsters had ambushed the caravan. The mercenaries told everyone to remain calm and put their trust in the escort team, but the number of monsters was overwhelming, and they quickly crushed one of the wagons like a leaf. The monsters drew ever closer, and the worst news was that leading this monster alliance was a behemoth, a bull-like monster with massive horns, immense power, and magical abilities. This monster was feared by many, as it was an S-rank monster that never appeared on common roads. While the assassins were wondering what to do next, Liesnet reminded everyone that they specialized in dealing with humans, not monsters. The mercenaries were being taken down by the monsters one by one, including the mighty behemoths. The Monster Alliance also included other formidable foes like B-rank or higher dire wolves and a giant boar. The assassins started thinking about escaping, but grew even more desperate when they saw this useless bunch of S-rankers still drunk in the middle of the day, completely oblivious to the situation. Liesnet was informed that there had been an S-rank mission to defeat these monsters, but when an S-rank party took it, they fled before completing it. She felt angry hearing about the existence of such idiotic S-rankers, but then quickly realized that those brainless S-rankers were none other than the wolf pack. Liesnet wondered if these guys were even capable of taking down a behemoth. Deciding to speak up to Cash and his crew to urge them to fight, she was met with a scornful look from Cash, who called her a weird woman and ignored what she said. This made Liesnet so furious that her teammates had to hold her back to keep her from killing Cash on the spot. Hopefully, the author doesn't intend to keep this useless S-rank group alive. Otherwise, we'll have to see them in every chapter. Meanwhile, Luke and Norris heard a noise outside and called for the carriage driver, but no one answered. Just then, the giant behemoth let out a deafening roar, causing the entire group to freeze in fear, a shiver running down their spines. Liesnet quickly realized that the recent orc attack was probably because they had been driven out of their territory by this terrifying behemoth. She could easily tell this behemoth was a dominant, aggressive, and overwhelming predator. The beast looked each of them straight in the eye, as if giving them a preview of the death that awaited. Cash could only tremble, collapsing to the ground, unable to move out of sheer terror. The behemoth rammed the carriage, shattering it with a single headbutt, and the whole group was sent flying, scattering in all directions like marbles played with by a child. The assassins managed to land safely, while Cash and the others crashed to the ground in a ridiculous pose, butts in the air. Liesnet told the wolf pack to prove their S-rank status and take the offensive. The behemoth roared thunderously, creating so much pressure that the very air around it seemed to crack, causing everyone to freeze in terror. Liesnet reminded them that defeating the behemoth was their mission from the start. Cash and his group were surprised that she knew this, But out of pride, they decided to stand tall before the behemoth to show off their S-rank confidence. The surrounding passengers cheered for the wolf pack, and even Liznet started to feel a glimmer of hope, as if a heroic soundtrack was beginning to play. Her eyes lit up, eager to witness the true power of an S-rank party. However, when the behemoth charged at an incredible speed, it effortlessly took down the entire wolf pack in a single blow, crushing all hope. What was worse, right after that, the wolf pack scattered and fled from the battlefield. Liznet couldn't allow herself to fail here, because every failure was a death sentence for her, as an image of burial with a sinister smile flashed in her mind. The other assassins were already prepared for both an attack and a retreat, so now they had to bear the responsibility left by the cowardly wolf pack members who had fled. Bravely standing before the high-level monsters, Liznet decided to lure the behemoth. Even as a seasoned assassin, her initial ambush strategy failed, as the behemoth quickly detected her and countered, forcing her to change tactics. Deciding to confront it head-on, Liznet used Melissa's wyvern knife, a deadly weapon. She threw a normal knife as a distraction, but Behemoth immediately blocked it. Taking advantage of the moment the monster lost her trail, she rushed in with the wyvern knife, aiming straight for its weak spots. Although her first strike was repelled, Liznet quickly dodged Behemoth's stomp and aimed for its eye, its weak point. Her critical strike seemed to have done the job, but it turned out Behemoth was resistant to poison. She was forced to resort to her last measure to end the battle, using the item she received from Prince Burial, a fragment of the Demon King's heart. Prince Burial had claimed that this fragment could make Liznet's flesh and bones so strong that she would become an incarnation of the Demon King. Meanwhile, in the capital, inside the palace, Princess Carla was being taught tea party etiquette by Lady Melinda, who hardly seemed like a model of proper decorum. Later, Carla sat in her room, watching a bird perched on a tree outside her window, and wondered if the curse maker, Gale, could remove the curse that imprisoned her, allowing her to live a free life. She looked out at the vast sky, feeling trapped in her own life. She then called Vivian in and asked about the Demon King's heart. Vivian explained that it was a kind of legend or a folk tale that had been passed down through generations. Carla thought it was just a fairy tale, but Vivian said there was a high probability that it was real, and that the Demon King's heart was considered a cursed item and the most feared of all things that exist in this world. Back to the battle between Liznet and Behemoth, Liznet had completely lost hope and was ready to be devoured. Just then, one of her comrades threw a stun grenade, causing Behemoth to loosen its grip and release Liznet. She quickly put on the cursed bracelet, which contained the power of the Demon King, and placed her hand on the beast's tail, ripping it apart with her bare hands. Behemoth charged toward her comrades, but Liznet intercepted it by grabbing its horns. This power allowed her to turn the tide of battle, but at the same time, it drained her of her life force. In that moment, Liznet looked like a completely different person, with her eyes turning a deep crimson. She lifted Behemoth into the air and smashed it back down onto the ground. The other monsters watched in terror as they saw their leader being cornered. She let out a laugh of overwhelming power, sending the terrified monsters fleeing. However, Liznet's comrades couldn't help but think that she was the one who looked more like a monster now. Suddenly, she started coughing up blood, and the assassins rushed to her aid. One of them arrived just in time, with a curse-breaking charm from the church to help free Liznet from the curse. They quickly placed the charm on the cursed bracelet, slowly removing it from Liznet's arm. She giggled, realizing that they had been through so much but had survived in the end, while the fake S-rank adventurer party did nothing at all. Finally, Liznet directed all her anger towards Gale. Meanwhile, at the Blacksmith's Guild in the agricultural city, Gale was sneezing nonstop and wondered who was thinking about him. He had successfully crafted many useful cursed items for Sharina in a short amount of time. Although they were all very useful, Sharina and Mora couldn't help but complain about their lack of aesthetic appeal. Sharina asked Gale if he was planning to go see the plot of land, but Gale didn't understand what she meant, so he asked her to clarify. Sharina explained that there was a perfect plot of land on a street just 1 block away from the central fair. Gail was excited, thinking it would become his shop, while Sharina remarked that it was a perfect fit for what he wanted in a pawn shop. She added that the shop was originally an empty store used by an alchemist to sell tools. Additionally, Sharina mentioned that with the money they earned from the cursed tools they sold, they could easily afford the deposit. Mora happily told Gale that it was the perfect location. Sharina added that once they cleaned and reorganized it, the space would become the best Gale shop ever. However, Sharina had many other plans for the shop. She planned to issue a notice allowing Gale to freely use the guild's forge and other facilities, ensuring he had everything he needed for his work. If only there were such amazing and kind shop managers like this in the real world, how great would that be? Elsewhere, a caravan of weavers had been traveling for 10 days, pushing forward despite a recent behemoth attack. The caravan consisted of many cargo wagons heading towards the agricultural city. Unfortunately, half of the wagons were damaged in the attack. On the bright side, they were rescued by a patrol along the road, allowing them to continue their journey to the agricultural city. However, the story had an interesting twist. It was said that Cash and his mischievous group had stopped the monster force led by the behemoth. Cash was extremely excited, basking in the stories of his bravery and feats, feeling like a king being fed grapes by a handmaiden. And of course, he loved being praised by the mercenaries, which made him feel truly special. His entire team was just as excited, thinking they would receive many rewards for their efforts. The members quickly chimed in, asserting that they had also worked hard and deserved praise. Well, who doesn't love a reward? However, Liznette was being sarcastic. She pretended to praise the other members, but in reality, she couldn't stand them. Liznette said she truly acknowledged their efforts, but in her heart, she couldn't forget that she hadn't received any help from them, which annoyed her even more. Liznette's sarcastic remarks revealed the tension within the group. Even though the group was celebrating their victory and discussing rewards, there were still underlying conflicts. They were all fighting for credit for things they didn't actually do, and no one could even remember how it all started. After being taken down by the behemoth, well, it's true the behemoth had given them a sound thrashing, but still, they claimed to have cut off its tail and injured its eye with a sharp horn, even though they were actually unconscious for the entire fight. It seems someone was on a delusional roller coaster ride. Even though everyone saw the blood on Melissa's knife, which she used to gouge out the behemoth's eye, Cash still insisted that the cut on the tail was caused by his mithril greatsword. He declared in front of everyone that he could feel the power to cut through anything with ease using that sword. However, only a few people actually witnessed what happened. The assassins were still unharmed, because other people got hurt during the ambush. Liznette just sat there silently, watching them all argue over such trivial matters, like a bunch of 5-year-olds. She even pointed out that there wasn't a single drop of blood on Cash's mithril greatsword. Liznette recalled that the members of Wolfpack had woken up after everything was already over, with no monsters in sight as the caravan continued to move forward. They had discovered an eyeball lying on the ground, and near it was Melissa's knife and the behemoth's horn. Cash tried to understand what had happened and quickly concluded that it was the assassins who had pushed back the behemoth, while they just stood and watched. Liznette, the one who actually took down the monster, refused to take credit, saying it would only hinder their mission. She believed that assassins shouldn't stand out, as it could bring them danger. Upon arriving in the agricultural city of Farm Edge, the passengers thanked the Wolfpack for helping to escort them safely, and so the Wolfpack was celebrated as saviors, the ace adventurers everyone admired. But wait, what about the assassins? They sat in the shadows, feeling left out of the glory party. In reality, they were the ones who actually did the dirty work of taking out the behemoth. Talk about a thankless job, like bringing snacks to movie night that no one even notices. Let's give a round of applause for our unsung heroes. Cash stepped up and planned what was next. They decided to rest, relax, and maybe get into a little mischief. But before they could get comfortable, Liznette noticed their shenanigans and suggested heading to the Adventurers Guild to trade the behemoth parts for cash. Luke agreed, thinking it was a good idea, especially since some shady characters might try to swipe the loot if they weren't careful. This is where things get interesting. Cash noticed something strange about this town. The lampposts were decorated with skeletons. Definitely not your typical decor, Norris and Luke agreed. But strangely, no one else seemed to notice. Norris suggested that this could be the work of Gale and his cursed tools. At first, Luke and Melissa were skeptical, but then the idea suddenly hit them like a ton of bricks. Gale must have been busy creating these bizarre things all by himself. Cash, ever the sharp one, connected the dots and figured there might be a cursed tool shop hiding somewhere around here. Gale might have dropped by the Adventurers Guild, but the story doesn't end there. Liznette's little mind games really paid off big time when the group decided to change plans and head to the Adventurers Guild. Classic Liznette, always one step ahead. Meanwhile, another assassin offered their speculation that Gale probably didn't trust the wolf pack, thinking he was using them as a cover while he secretly worked his artifact crafting magic. Well, who's going to break the news to him? Finally, the group entered the Adventurers Guild, ready to cash in on their supposedly hard-earned spoils. The moment they stepped inside, they were taken aback by the place's classic design. Like a blast from the past, Norris quickly realized there weren't any worthwhile quests posted, but they weren't here for a quest today. With his usual arrogant swagger, Cash spotted the reception desk and walked over, ready to talk to what he assumed was just a regular staff member. But unbeknownst to him, the person he was talking to was actually Gimli, the guild master of the Adventurers Guild. Cash, in his usual boastful style, started talking about his S-rank team, the Wolf Pack, and told Liznette to bring over the parts of the behemoth they defeated, like the horn, tail, and an eye. Gimli looked over the items and asked if this was all of it. Cash, like the big hero he was, insisted they deserved a valuable reward. Since anyone could see these were parts from a behemoth, Norris added that they could have gotten high-value alchemy materials in the capital. Gimli smiled and said that they'd need to bring the behemoth's head or heart as proof, not just these few scraps. Realizing they weren't going to get anything, Cash and his buddies stormed out of the guild in a huff. Gimli cheerfully told them to come back with the whole beast next time. Talk about a major blow to their egos. As they left, Gimli suddenly asked Liznette which group she belonged to, implying that she already knew the truth. Liznette and her team, the ones who had actually taken down the behemoth, quickly realized that Gimli was a top-tier expert in their line of work and decided they needed to get out of town fast. Meanwhile, at Gale's soon-to-be-opened Cursed Goods shop, things were progressing well. Gale had finished the decorations, and Sharina, his right-hand woman, gave her honest opinion, remarking that the shop seemed bland, but it suits your personality. The shop was decorated with large fangs and bones, looking like an ancient cave. Sharina reassured Gale that he could still take on quests from the guild, and she would help him manage the store, just as they were about to celebrate a job well done. Mora showed up, impressed with the shop and offering to help with preparations. Gale, grateful, promised to visit the Blacksmith's Guild often. He wanted to run the shop, but he also wanted to continue being an adventurer. However, he didn't have enough money to hire a manager, so Mora suggested they take turns. Gale, oblivious as ever, didn't pick up on Mora's subtle confession, instead focusing on his cursed items. As night fell, Gale heard the shop's bell ring. Oh no, here comes trouble. Cash and the Wolfpack party stormed into Gale's shop, accusing him of making them suffer with his curses and demanding he remove them immediately. Gale was surprised and confused when he realized they were talking about the enchantments he had placed on their gear. He was completely taken aback by the accusations, as he had gone through a lot of trouble to maintain those charms. Outside, Liznette and her group of assassins watched in secret, finding the situation hilarious and seeing it as an opportunity to gauge Gale's true strength. Inside, Cash and his cronies were getting more aggressive. Gale remembered the hardships he had endured because of them, and a sense of outrage boiled up as he recalled them calling him useless and kicking him out, only for them to now blame him for their troubles. Cash was furious, convinced that Gale had cursed him and his teammates. He didn't believe Gale when he denied placing any curses on them. Cash grew even angrier and confessed that he had intentionally destroyed Gale's cursing tools out of spite, even smashing a precious item, a mummified corpse. Clearly, Cash needs some anger management classes, stat. Melissa asked why Gale's creepy item was so important. Gale became even more enraged, and Luke decided to stir up trouble. By throwing a knife at the cursing tools, shattering the display shelf, Norris added to the chaos by casting a fire spell, causing Gale to beg them to stop before they burned the whole shop down. Cash grabbed Gale by the collar, demanding he remove the curse. Gale insisted that their stats were back to normal, and there were no curses whatsoever, but Cash refused to believe him, adamant that there was no way they could be that weak. Enraged, Cash declared the only way to break the curse was to kill Gale. Talk about an overreaction. Gale, now absolutely livid, punched Cash straight in the face. Boom! Cash went flying out of the shop. Gale was surprised by his own strength, but hey, in a small space, a punch connects fast. Outside, Liznette and her assassins saw Cash get thrown out. Gale wasn't just defending himself, he was defending the kind people who had welcomed him in Farm Edge. He declared he would settle things outside. A 1 versus 4 battle began, Gale versus the Wolf Pack. Liznette and her assassins had their own plans to kidnap Gale, but for now, they just watched, finding that things were going just as they'd hoped. She thought to herself that the Wolf Pack were truly useful idiots. Cash, Melissa, and Norris prepared to fight Gale for real. They bragged about spending a lot of money on the power-up items. Cash pulled out strength potions, and the whole group drank them, glowing just like in a video game. Their stats shot up. Ready to face Gale, Gale was surprised to see the high-grade enhancement items the Wolfpack was using, which even displayed their boosted stats. Cash proudly boasted about their enhancement items, saying Gale could never get his hands on anything this top tier. He declared that the group was back to their original strength, even though they had never been this strong before. Without listening to Gale's explanation, they charged in with their signature wolf pack tactic. Norris claimed Gale wouldn't understand the tactic, since he was never allowed to participate in it before. In reality, their tactic was very simple: surround a target and attack from all sides. Gale remembered this ridiculous tactic from his time with the group. Cash was the main attacker, so Gale focused on him, but Melissa struck first. Gale dodged it thanks to his quick reflexes, but she was much stronger thanks to the enhancement potion. Next came Luke with his poison-coated knives. Gale rolled away to dodge, and Luke threatened to run him through next time. Gale knew Luke was dangerous with his poison daggers. Cash then charged in, but Gale dodged again. Cash was stunned to realize Gale could predict his movements. However, Gale's biggest concern was Norris's fire magic. Even if he dodged it, the town could be set ablaze. Cash, Melissa, and Luke cut off all of Gale's escape routes, determined to trap him. But to their surprise, Gale already had a plan. He pulled out some scrolls, curse tools. Gale wasn't just dodging, he was luring the wolf pack into a trap. He knew they had used enhancement items, so he needed to weaken them with curse tools. Gale challenged them to take a hit from these tools. He used the scrolls at the perfect moment, when everyone was within range. The tables had turned. Gale may have been outnumbered, but he still had some special curse tricks up his sleeve. He took out his special curse tool, called the Curse of Sorrow. The moment the Curse of Sorrow activated, Cash and his group immediately felt its effects. Gale explained that the tool was crafted from the ashes of a wrongfully executed prisoner, containing a lifetime of resentment and suffering. Gale recalled the first time he discovered this cursed energy while exploring some ancient ruins. There, he had found a restless spirit trapped within a wall, filled with rage and sorrow. Gale had felt pity for the spirit, so he used a curse-breaking spell to set it free. The spirit had been incredibly grateful, even shedding tears of relief before fading away peacefully. This experience had inspired Gale to create that curse tool. Back in the battle, Gale knew the Curse of Sorrow might not be as powerful as the Wolfpack's buffs, but it could at least slow them down. And just as he predicted, it worked. Cash and his cronies immediately felt their bodies grow heavy, significantly weakened despite their enhancement potions. Cash tried to shrug it off, saying Gale's curse tool wouldn't do a thing. But Gale had a plan. He started to run, luring the Wolfpack out of town to avoid harming civilians. Gale headed for the underground cemetery, thinking the terrain there would give him an advantage. Looking back, Gale saw 4 dark figures still chasing him. Back at the shop, Cash and his group were still trapped by the effects of the curse tool. Cash's group was astonished by the power of the curses Gale had created, which far exceeded what they had imagined. Before Gale started running, Liznette had realized that he was the true creator of the artifacts. She grew curious about how many artifacts Gale might possess. The other assassins asked Liznette what to do next, as the villagers were starting to notice the commotion. Hearing the footsteps of the guards, Liznette felt a strange pressure, suspecting it might be the influence of the Demon King's heart. Realizing the situation was risky, she ordered an immediate retreat, as she herself was feeling the effects of Gale's cursed tool. The tool's area of effect was larger than she had anticipated, and its power overwhelmed Liznette. Growing weaker by the second, Liznette decided to pull back. While the assassins were shocked at the terrifying power of Gale's curse, far surpassing all of their preparations. Trying to escape the dark aura of the cursed tool, Liznette noticed Gale running into the distance. She wondered why he would run after weakening them so much. Knowing there wasn't much time, Liznette ordered her group to pursue Gale. They were worried about Gale's masterful use of the cursed artifact, seeing him as a dangerous and cunning opponent. As Gale ran toward the outskirts, Liznette thought he was a fool for choosing the cemetery, a place where an assassin like her could use the shadows to her advantage. But the chase took an unexpected turn. As the assassins began to grow exhausted, struggling to keep up, they thought Gale was using a speed-enhancing potion, but then realized they were the ones being affected by his curse. Desperate to catch him, Liznette ordered her team to capture or kill Gale at all costs. Too focused on their mission, they failed to notice the ominous signs around them. As they rushed forward in their fervor, they accidentally awakened the legendary Behemoth, a terrifying and colossal S-class monster, looming like a dark cloud over the town of Farm Edge. You know the situation is tense when you see the locals hastily locking their doors and hiding under their beds. Meanwhile, Cash and his companions were trapped, as helpless as turtles on their backs. Thanks to Gale's cursed tool, Mora appeared, drawn by the commotion and ready for a fight. Cash recognized her instantly and couldn't believe Mora was in Farm Edge. The whole group was struck by her beauty, but couldn't hide their annoyance. Cash recalled the incident of Gale's exile and thought of what they considered Mora's betrayal, prompting Norris to quickly jump in and draw a ridiculous conclusion. Norris confidently claimed that Mora and Gale had been plotting together all along and was proud of himself for uncovering the secret, but Mora just shook her head at his stupidity. She tried to explain, but no one would listen. Norris, in his arrogance, even insulted her, which made Mora genuinely furious. Mora sarcastically said there was no way she was involved with Gale like they imagined. Cash demanded she explain why she was here, but seeing no point in telling the truth, Mora decided to taunt them by agreeing with their ridiculous assumptions. She then challenged them, asking what she had done to make them drag themselves all the way to the countryside just to wreck Gale's shop and treat their own team member so badly. Cash was terrified as he remembered the time Mora had beaten their entire crew in a bar fight, and realized that now, with the power of Gale's curse, they were even weaker than before. Mora mocked them for going to all the trouble of marching to this rural town just to cause trouble and make themselves even more miserable. Determined to teach them a lesson, Cash desperately tried to use the Wolfpack's tactics, but they were too slow and weak now. Mora easily blocked Cash's attack and mocked him for attempting his pathetic Blade Rain move. Then she showed him what a real Blade Rain looked like. Pummeling Cash with her bare hands until he passed out, Melissa tried to sneak attack Mora from behind. But she quickly countered, punching Melissa so hard in the face that her nose started bleeding like a broken faucet. This was truly a one-sided beatdown. Mora wasn't one to back down from a challenge, but she also didn't want to fight with the weight of Gale's curse holding her opponents down, which made it feel like playing tag with 4 children. She was practically dancing circles around them. But wait, Luke and Norris weren't giving up yet. The poor things were trying to talk tough, threatening Mora with their knives and little magic tricks. It was like watching puppies bark at a full-grown wolf. You almost wanted to pat them on the head and say, "Nice try, kids." Luke tried to throw his knives as if he were some ninja warrior, but Mora didn't even break a sweat. With bulging muscles, she dodged the knives effortlessly, as if she were playing jump rope in a park. It was just too easy for her. Mora's expression turned serious, ready to show Luke and Norris who was boss. With just a flick of her wrist and a cold glare, she prepared to teach them an unforgettable lesson. Now, only the last 2 members of the wolf pack, Luke and Norris, remained. If anyone ever needed a lesson on what not to do when fighting a girl who just beat up all your friends, Luke and Norris were the poster children. After talking a big game, Luke turned to grab a throwing knife, only to realize he'd already used them all while trashing Gale's shop. And in that moment, he knew he was screwed. Before Luke could even form another thought, he looked up, and all he saw was Mora's fist heading straight for his face in slow motion, followed by an unforgiving punch. Mora sent Luke flying backward. Only Norris was left, who had been using the time to chant a spell that he was confident would be a deadly hell shot. But contrary to its impressive name, when Norris cast the spell, only a tiny spark fizzled out. Without missing a beat, Mora threw the bottle of wine she'd brought to celebrate the shop's opening, right at Norris's face. The bottle shattered, sending him to his knees. Mora had won, getting well-deserved revenge for Gale after everything they had put him through. While she didn't have a single scratch on her, the wolf pack looked like they had just been through World War III. Cash got on his knees, clasping his hands and begging Mora for forgiveness. They really should have been called the chicken pack instead of the wolf pack, though that might be an insult to chickens. After dealing with them, Mora suddenly wondered where Gale was. She noticed a few villagers had gathered on the street in front of the shop and went to take a look. What she saw left her stunned. Everything had been smashed to pieces, including the mummy Gale had worked so hard to create, his star product. Remembering the smile on his face as he admired his prized creation, Mora realized that although she used to be annoyed by his obsession with these gruesome objects, she now felt sad and angry seeing it destroyed. As she was about to leave the shop to take her anger out on Cash's group, Sharina suddenly appeared, her hands full of drinks. The scene inside the shop left her speechless with shock. She asked Mora what had happened, but Mora replied that she needed to find Gale first. Sharina stopped her and demanded an explanation. However, Mora couldn't think straight, and her words were jumbled and hard to understand. Sharina then asked if she knew where Gale might have gone. Mora replied that he wasn't the type to be easily beaten by the likes of Cash, so he had surely tried to lead them out of town to avoid causing trouble for the residents. Gimli interrupted their conversation, saying that Gale had headed towards the ruins of the old nursing home. She leaned against the wall, smiling casually. Mora and Sharina were surprised, wondering how Gimli knew this, and she simply said it was just a coincidence. Gimli added that she was here to deal with those idiots from the wolf pack and the pile of organic trash they had brought with them. She also revealed to Mora and Sharina that a group was tailing Cash, and they seemed very professional, far beyond the chicken pack. Hearing this, Mora became extremely worried about Gale and immediately turned to go find him. Gimli stopped her and asked if she was really going out in her current dress. Mora declared that she didn't have time to go back and change in such a crisis. Sharina decided to join her, grabbing Cash's mithril sword and handing Mora a dagger. It was better than nothing. They prepared themselves with their makeshift weapons and quickly set off on their special mission to rescue Gail Hamilton. Seeing their determined spirits, Gimli took responsibility for leading the way, stressing that every second counted in a situation like this. Gimli also said she felt that something ominous was waiting for them up ahead. Mora asked Gimli if she was referring to the people who were tracking the wolf pack, and Gimli replied yes, but that she also sensed a non-human presence nearby. Gimli revealed that the organic trash was actually from a behemoth. Just hearing the name was enough to make them feel immense pressure. The behemoth was a disaster-level species. She further explained that the people with the wolf pack had injured the behemoth, but it had escaped. However, now that they were here, the beast may have followed their trail for revenge. Mora and Sharina were terrified by the news of the beast, and Sharina stressed that if they encountered it now, the mission's difficulty would skyrocket to AA rank. Meanwhile, Gale had stopped after reaching a cemetery. Liznette and the other assassins emerged from the bushes, looking utterly exhausted and annoyed. They begged Gale to stop for a moment to catch their breath. He quickly realized that he had seen these people somewhere before. Gale recalled that they were the ones with Cash standing outside the shop earlier. To his surprise, Liznette shouted a denial, insisting that there was no way they were associated with scumbags like the Wolf Pack. The shouting made her throat even drier, and Gale, with a gallant spirit, offered her a potion to drink since there was no water around. Liznette quickly grabbed it and drank it all in one go, then asked Gale what it was because it had a rather unpleasant smell. Gale smiled proudly, explaining that she'd just drunk an experimental petrification potion that he had brewed from the liquid waste of a cockatrice. After hearing that, Liznette surely wished she had a time machine. Liquid started to ooze from her nose and mouth, and in a rage, she threw the empty vial back at Gale. Anyone would wonder why a person, hearing someone was thirsty, would immediately offer them a cup of monster juice. The other assassins also reminded Liznette that she was partly to blame for not checking it before drinking, despite being a veteran assassin. Gale reassured them that it wasn't a big deal because medicine is supposed to taste bitter, after all. This only made Liznette hate him more. She immediately drew her knife and ordered everyone to seize Gale at once. The others also drew their weapons, while Gale was still trying to piece things together to understand the situation. He tried to explain everything, but Liznette bluntly said she didn't care if he lived or died. She just wanted to make sure he wouldn't leave here in one piece. Gale scratched his head in confusion, thinking the potion must have been terrible to make her this furious. Liznette lunged at Gale with her dagger, aiming to kill him outright. But he dodged her every move. When she ordered the assassins to attack all at once, somehow, Gale still managed to evade all of their attacks. He was amused by the confused looks on their faces and told them to look down at the ground, where fragments of bone and human skulls were scattered everywhere. He had used them to track the assassins. Every time they stepped on a fragment or a bone, he could easily pinpoint their location and dodge their attacks. Furious, Liznette demanded to know why he was so skilled at fighting in a graveyard and why he chose this place. It turned out Gale came here often to gather materials for his cursed items. But the reason was bigger than that. This was where he hid his trump card. A place where empty souls still wandered was perfect for a curse crafter to unleash his full potential. Gale raised his hands, smiled, and announced to the assassins that his friends were about to come welcome them. Liznette and her comrades secretly worried about an ambush. But a foul stench set off alarm bells. That something far more terrible than they could imagine was about to appear. Suddenly, the ground began to shake as if the land itself was trembling in fear. From beneath the gravestones, an army of the undead rose, their faces decomposed. Gale stood in the center of this deadly vortex, his arms crossed authoritatively. Perhaps he didn't even realize the true potential of what he had just summoned. Meanwhile, at the royal palace, Carla's eyes were glued to Gale's wanted poster. Lying in bed, she wondered if the wolf pack could bring him back. Vivian entered, leading High Priest Aurelie and Lord Elizola into her room and asking them to assess Carla's condition. She asked how someone could be so infatuated with a man she had only met once. The priest reminded her that the meeting had saved her life. Elizola was surprised to learn that in the most dangerous moment of her life, Carla had fallen for Gale. The more they talked, the more frustrated Vivian became. The priest pointed out that Carla and Gale shared unique interests and values. Throughout their 10-minute conversation, Carla's eyes never left the comical sketch of Gale. Elizola smiled and commented that when you can't be with the one you love, your image of them becomes more idealized. All the love in the air was making Vivian miserable. In the graveyard, the battle with the undead had begun. The creatures' hollow eyes glowed eerily, and their tattered clothes hung from their rotting bodies. Liznette was shocked to realize that all this time they were chasing Gale. They were the ones being led into a trap. Some of the undead were mere skeletons, while others were grotesque zombies with decaying flesh hanging from their bones. They advanced on the assassins, who backed away, horrified by something they couldn't comprehend. Liznette swung her dagger at one of the undead and decapitated it, but their morale plummeted even further when ghosts appeared from another dimension. Now, they weren't just fighting zombies, but ghosts as well. Gale probably didn't realize he could conquer an entire kingdom with this kind of power. He explained that he knew he'd be at a disadvantage facing Cash's group alone. Gale had meticulously planned for this situation, and being associated with Cash's group annoyed Liznette more than fighting the undead. She reminded Gale that they were nothing like the wolf pack, and finally introduced her group as assassins who live in the shadows. Unfazed by a battle against a horde of zombies, as she spoke, Liznette charged in like a storm, decapitating over 10 zombies in a matter of seconds. Gale remarked that her skills were impressive, but still not enough to stand against his legion. Meanwhile, the members of her group were struggling to cover their blind spots. Liznette quickly ordered them to form a defensive circle to draw Gale inside. The group started to feel hopeful, thinking they might be able to take Gale down. But she still had an ace up her sleeve. The only problem was that this ace had many restrictions, so she was waiting for the right moment to use the cursed ring containing the Demon King's heart once all the undead were wiped out. Liznette flashed a confident smile, while Gale looked at her puzzled. However, that smile probably wouldn't last long, because her trump card was nothing compared to the strategies Gale had prepared. Meanwhile, Gimli, Sharina, and Mora were running as fast as they could. They knew that a group of assassins was targeting Gale and wanted to get to the scene quickly to even the odds. Little did they know that Gale was actually a one-man army. The trio was starting to realize Gale's importance now that he wasn't with them. Sharina screamed his name, declaring that they still had many promises to fulfill, including creating countless cursed tools and bringing an industrial revolution to the village of Farmad. Gimli also admitted that she'd be in big trouble if he were to disappear. The thought of never seeing him again brought Mora to the verge of tears. She promised that the next time she saw him, she would confess everything. Sharina reminded them that there was still the threat of the behemoth to be wary of. If they ran into both the assassins and the beast at the same time, things would get incredibly difficult. Gimli asserted that if they could reach Gale before facing the enemy, they would have a chance of survival. In truth, although the profession of a cursed toolmaker was often looked down upon, if Gale were to focus on a specific field, he could awaken a unique power called reverse luck. With this ability, he could turn any misfortune on its head. Truly the plot armor of a protagonist. Their only hope of escaping this dangerous situation was for Gale to truly awaken that power. Thanks to their sheer willpower, Liznette and her group finally wiped out the entire legion of the undead. But now, they didn't have the strength to take another step. She raised her hand and declared that seeing Gale so easily control the army of the dead had completely demoralized her. Gale smiled and gently suggested she give up. Liznette stepped forward, extending her hand as if to surrender, just as Gale was about to return her handshake. Liznette pulled her hand back and ordered her comrades to quickly hand over the artifact. Gale's eyes widened in alarm. She burst into maniacal laughter and proudly declared this was her trump card, an artifact that enhances all physical abilities. but at the cost of the user's life force. While Liznet was busy boasting about the power of the cursed item, Gale suddenly cut her off, clarifying that he wasn't shocked by the artifact, but by the monster charging at her from behind. Liznet froze when she saw the behemoth, fear written all over her face. She had waited patiently for this moment to catch Gale off guard. But unfortunately for her, it was the behemoth that had the upper hand. Realizing she couldn't dodge the monster's attack in time, she closed her eyes, preparing to accept her death. However, Gale is the protagonist for a reason. He decided to push Liznet aside to save her instead of dodging the attack himself. That's +1 point for his harem. If he survives, Gale took the full force of the blow, flying straight into a nearby house. Liznet was certain there was no way he could have survived that impact. She should have been happy, but this bothered her even more. Why would the person she was trying to kill save her? Looking at the behemoth, Liznet commanded the Demon King's heart to devour her, preparing for a fight to the death. Meanwhile, Gale, who had just been sent flying, fell through a hole in the roof and landed on a bed. If he had hit the ground, he surely would have suffered irreparable injuries. It seems he's truly mastered the ability of dumb luck. Gale started to wonder about the identity of the monster that had just attacked them. After racking his brain, he concluded it must be the undead beast Sharina was always complaining about, the one that ravaged the farms. It was a mystery how he could be this dense. He must have either been dropped on his head as a child, or his brain had merged with a black hole from outer space. There was no other logical explanation. Deciding that he had to return to the battlefield to help Liznet and her group, the very people who had tried to kill him just seconds before, Gale quickly realized that he had fallen too far, and was also completely disoriented. Gale was uncertain if he would make it back in time to help Lynette. The behemoth was down to one eye, one horn, and was missing half its tail. Yet Liznet was still struggling against it. Even with the power of the Demon King, she was struggling against the monster's fearsome strength. The fight was so intense that her assassin companions could only watch from a distance. One of them suggested that she should switch weapons, but she insisted she could rip the monster's head off with her own hands. Unlike Gale, luck was not on her side. Liznet started coughing up blood and collapsed to the ground. Her assassin companions rushed to her side to help, and one of them noticed that the curse was starting to eat away at her heart. One by one, her power buffs started to fade as the curse took hold. Two members of the group tried to approach the behemoth to create a diversion, while the other tried to dispel the curse on Liznet. Unfortunately, their strength was no match for the behemoth. A single one of its blows sent them flying, with blood gushing from their mouths. After dealing with the nuisances, the behemoth turned back, its ferocious gaze fixed on Liznet as it charged toward her. Liznet tried to order her companion to quickly dispel the curse, but unfortunately, not even the church's highest-grade dispel item had any effect. She lost consciousness for just a moment before waking up again. Her trained assassin's instincts wouldn't let her stay down, but that just meant she had to endure every bit of the pain that was racking her body. Just when she thought things couldn't possibly get any worse, fate dealt another crushing blow. A dark entity, drawn by the pile of undead corpses on the ground. The sky suddenly darkened, and a mysterious figure appeared. The wielder of the giant scythe was none other than the god of death, a Shinigami. The situation had escalated far beyond anyone's predictions, and the air grew thick with absolute terror. The Shinigami's voice alone brought a horrifying pressure down upon them all. Even the ferocious behemoth was frozen in terror. Even the fragments of the Demon King's heart inside Liznet stopped beating, and the Shinigami turned, its attention drawn to the dark aura emanating from her. Meanwhile, Liznet was calculating her chances of survival. She realized her soul could be reaped by the scythe, the curse could claim her heart, or she could be torn to shreds by the behemoth. No matter what she did, in the end, it was still death. The Grim Reaper summoned a mirror and ordered Liznet to reflect upon her life. She told him she was born into a poor family and had to serve the nobility. She had been jealous of the luxurious lives of the noble ladies and, sick of the abuse, so she ran away and fell into the life of an assassin. She laughed bitterly, saying that perhaps this was her karma, for she had once been the one to take the lives of others, and now it was her turn to pay the price. The Grim Reaper asked her about the future she desired. As silly as it might sound, Liznette confessed that she hoped to one day give up her life as an assassin and hide away in the village of Farm Edge, hoping someone would accept her, no questions asked. When she finished speaking, the Grim Reaper let out a cold laugh, revealing that he was just toying with her, that it would never happen. Then he swung his scythe at her as Liznette stared on in utter disbelief. In this dark scene, all hope rests on our protagonist, the only one who can slay the behemoth, defeat the Grim Reaper, and lift the curse from Liznette. The only problem is, nobody knows where he is.